This is one of the great stories of mankind, and it's not, this isn't the only variant of this story. There's many variants of it, but this variant is useful for our purposes. That's a story I stumbled across a long time ago. I'm going to tell you the second story first because I don't have the energy to tell you the first story. So this is a story that the ancient Egyptians predicated their society on. And to understand this story, the first thing you have to know is what the characters were. And these characters were gods. There's 4 of them. Although the Egyptians had far more than 4 gods. You might think of these as the central gods. And you might think, what is a central god? And then you might think, well, imagine that the gods compete for dominance across time in people's imaginations. And some gods win. And they occupy the primary position of dominance in the hierarchy, in the dominance hierarchy of gods. And those are ideals. And ideals compete across time for dominance. And they're embodied. And so when diverse tribal people come together, they throw all their gods into the ring and they fight across time, and something emerges as a victor. And that's the emergence of monotheism out of polytheism. And it parallels the development of a unified morality within each of us as we develop across time. And the God that emerges as dominant across time bears a substantial resemblance. Imagine you have a set of gods in this locale that are competing across time, and something emerges as dominant. And then over here you have another set of gods that compete across time for dominance, and something emerges. You'll see major commonalities across the 2 things that emerge. And the reason for that is because the process of emergence that gives rise to both of them is similar in both situations. And that's part of what accounts for the cross-cultural similarity of high-order religious ideas. All right, anyways, you need to know the characters. Osiris. Osiris is the old king. He's Dumbledore for all intents and purposes. He's the old king. He's the spirit that established the Egyptian state when he was young. He was a great hero, but now he's old. And he's archaic, and he's willfully blind. That's Osiris. He has a brother, Seth. Seth is Set. And Set is Satan, because the word Satan comes from the word Seth and Set via the Coptic Christians. So he's a precursor to the Western idea of Satan. You have Isis. Isis is queen of the underworld, and Isis was the goddess of a religious structure that prevailed across thousands and thousands of years. Isis. And you have Horus. Horus is a falcon, and the Egyptian eye. Everyone knows that eye, right? The eye with the open pupil. That's Horus. And Horus is a falcon because falcons can see way better. They can see better than us. They can see better than anything else except for perhaps eagles. And they fly above everything. Zazu in Lion King is Horus, right? And Mufasa is Osiris. And Scar is Seth. And there's no specific representation of Isis, but the closest there is in that story is probably the Queen of the Hyenas that's played by, who's the actress? Yes, Whoopi Goldberg. That's right. Because she's like the queen of the underworld, right? She's the queen of the hyenas that live out among the death. But, okay, anyways. Seth, Osiris, Seth, Isis, and Horus. Here's how the story goes. Osiris is a great king. He established the Egyptian state. You could think about him as the embodiment of Egyptian custom and tradition. You could think about him as the thing that the pyramid represents. All right? But he was great when he was young, but he's not young anymore. He's old, and he's willfully blind. And what that means is that he doesn't see what he could see. He refuses to see what he could see. Why is Osiris old and willfully blind? Because that's what culture is. It's a paternal spirit that's old and willfully blind, and it's always that way, always that way. And the reason for that is because it's a construction of the dead. The dead aren't alive. They can't, so they're out of date, and they can't update themselves anymore. And you inhabit their corpse. And that's actually what happens in an earlier story that I'll tell you next week. The early Mesopotamian gods inhabited the corpse of their father, roughly speaking. Anyway, so Osiris was great and when he was young, but he isn't young anymore. He's old and he's willfully blind. He won't look where he knows he should look. He doesn't have the energy, or maybe he doesn't have the spirit. His brother Seth is not a good guy. And Osiris knows it, but he underestimates his malevolence and power. And so Seth wants to rule the kingdom. So what does that mean? It's easy. Every stable society is threatened by willful blindness and malevolence. Always. Every bureaucracy has that proclivity to stagnate and to become blind. That's why corporations die all the time. That's why a Fortune 500 company only lasts 30 years. It's why we have to have elections. It's to stop the dead from staying in control for too long. Osiris turns a blind eye to Seth. Seth is happy about that. Same thing happens in the Lion King, roughly speaking. Seth one day waits for Osiris to make a mistake and to be weak, and he attacks him and he chops him up into pieces. And he distributes the pieces across the entire Egyptian state. In fact, the Egyptians regarded their provinces as pieces of Osiris's body. Okay, so now you can't kill Osiris because he's a god. And why is he God? A god because he represents the spirit of structure. And there's always structure. It can't be destroyed. It always reconstitutes itself. It can be hurt and broken into pieces, which is exactly what happens to Osiris. Things fall apart. Why? Because they get old and because malevolence undermines them. That's what the Egyptians were trying to sort out. Okay, so Seth distributes his Osiris all over Egypt so he can't get himself back together. Right? Things fall apart and they can't be brought back together. But the spirit of Osiris still lives in the pieces. So what happens? Order is demolished. What would you expect? Chaos emerges. That's Isis. Isis is queen of the underworld. She's Osiris's wife. Order and chaos, just like the yin and the yang. Order collapses, up comes the queen of the underworld. She's looking for order. Chaos cries out for order. She's looking for order. She goes all around Egypt trying to put Osiris back together. It's a state of chaos. She finds his phallus. She makes herself pregnant with it. And what does that mean? Well, it means it's like Geppetto in the belly of the whale. That thing has the potential to reemerge. The thing that collapses into its pieces is still alive. It can unite with the chaos and produce something new. That's the story of the dissolution of structure into chaos and then its revivification. Isis makes herself pregnant. She goes back down to the underworld. She gives birth to Horus. Horus is the Egyptian eye. He's the son of the great father and the great mother. He's a messianic figure. And in fact, much of the mythology that described Horus was extracted without much modification and then attributed to Christ. Very much, and you can read about the parallels. You can read about it online if you want. But there's any number of parallels. And of course, there is the mythology that the Jews came out of Egypt, and of course the Christians emerged from the Jews. And so there was a tremendous influence of Egyptian thinking on the development of these later ideas. And you see pictures of Isis with Horus on her lap that are virtually identical in content and form to the later pictures of Mary with the infant Christ. And that's the holy mother of God in the hero. It's not a Christian motif. It's far deeper than a Christian motif. It's a human motif. So Isis, queen of the underworld, gives birth to Horus, and Horus grows up outside the kingdom. Why? In the underworld. Because that's what human beings do. You're alienated from your culture. Always. Why? It's old and dead and corrupt. And so that leaves you growing up in chaos. What would you call? Alienated from your fundamental culture. That's the story of adolescence. Horus grows up. He can see. That's what differentiates him from Osiris. That's why he's a falcon. He goes and has a fight with Seth. And now the difference between Osiris and Horus is that Horus does not underestimate Seth. He knows exactly what he's up against. He goes and has a terrible battle with him, trying to get his kingdom back. Something else that's echoed in the Lion King story. And while Horus and Osiris or Seth are fighting, Seth tears out one of his eyes. Now why? Because Seth is the embodiment of destruction and malevolence, and no matter how conscious you are, if you encounter that, even voluntarily, the probability that it's going to damage your consciousness is extraordinarily high. That's why people don't do it. So the eye is torn out, but Seth is defeated, and Horus banishes him to the nether regions of the kingdom. You can't kill him. Why? Because the malevolent, destructive force that threatens states never dies. It's always there. You can only remove it temporarily. Now Horus is king. Pharaoh, king, God. He's got his eye, and so you think, well, he's going to just pop that back in his head, and then he's going to be able to lead. He's going to be able to take his place at the uppermost pantheon of gods properly. But that isn't what he does. He takes his eye and he goes back to the underworld, just like Pinocchio going into the depths to rescue Geppetto. And down there is the spirit of Osiris, who's extant as a kind of half-dead ghost. And he gives Osiris his eye. Now Osiris can see. So what does that mean? You go down into the chaotic, when threatened by malevolence, even to the point of damage to your consciousness. You go down into the chaos and you find the dead spirit of your tradition and you give it vision. And so, provided with vision, Osiris regenerates, and then Osiris and Horus go back up to the world, linked together and rule jointly. And the Egyptians believed that the Pharaoh, who had an immortal spirit, was the embodiment of the conjunction of Horus and Osiris. And that's what gave him sovereignty. And so you think about how brilliant that is. The Egyptians are trying to puzzle out who should lead, who should be Pharaoh, and what do you have to be if you're going to be Pharaoh in order for things to work. You have to be awake to malevolence and chaos, and you have to embody your tradition. And that puts you at the highest pinnacle of the dominant structure. And that's the same as, it's the same thing. It's the same thing as the battle between the gods across centuries or eons and the emergence of the highest possible moral virtue as a consequence of that competition. It's the eye on the top of the pyramid, right? It's, you know, in the Washington Monument, there's a cap on the Washington Monument. The top of the Washington Monument is a pyramid. At the top of the pyramid is a cap. It's made out of aluminum. And the reason it's made out of aluminum is because when they made the Washington Monument, it was the most valuable metal known. And so what does it mean? It means there's a pyramid and there's something at the top of it. But the thing that's at the top of the pyramid isn't the same as the rest of the pyramid. That's the thing. The pyramid exists. There's a dominance hierarchy. Something climbs up to the top. But it's not just at the top of one pyramid. It's at the top of all of them. The thing that rises to the top of any given pyramid is the same thing that can dominate all pyramids. It isn't good enough to be the best at a dominance hierarchy. What you want to be is the best at the set of all possible dominance hierarchies. Right. And that's the thing that's gold at the top of the pyramid, and that's the eye. That's what the Egyptians figured out. And what does that mean? It means the thing that puts you at the top is attention. Pay attention. Keep your eyes open. It's not the same as thinking. It's not the same thing. It's like watching. And the thing about human beings is we can see. We can see better than any other creature except birds of prey. And so our capacity to see is in fact what we use in the world. Our brains are actually organized around vision, unlike most animals. Their brains are organized around smell, not us. We can see. We stand upright so we can see a long distance. And in our ability to see is what saves us and what saves our communities. And that's what these stories are trying to portray. And you might say, well, why didn't people just say so? And the answer to that is because they didn't know. It took a long time to figure it out. Forever. It's taken forever to figure it out. It's part of what I hoped when I wrote this book, and part of the reason that I'm teaching it is because it seems to me that it would be useful for everyone to actually understand this instead of just having it told as a story. It's like, that's great, man. Yes, you need the story. But why not also just understand it? So imagine you have a goal in mind. You want to get to work in the morning. I used to ask my students a question like this, is like, what? Maybe they're going to write an essay. Why are you writing the essay? Why are you in class? Well, I'm in class because I need this class because it's part of my major. Well, why did you pick a major like that? Well, I'm interested in psychology. Well, why did you come to get a degree? Well, I think I need a degree to get a job. Well, why do you need a job? Well, I need a job to keep body and soul together, and maybe to be productive, and maybe to, establish a name for myself. And why do you want to do that? Well, because, it's part and parcel of living properly. And why do you want to live properly? And and how would you live if you lived properly? And at that point, people are usually unable to answer, because you can just push people with questions about why until they run out of explanations. But the point is that you're always doing whatever you're doing because what you're doing is nested in a sequence of goal-directed actions. And those can be more or less sophisticated. If you're not very sophisticated at all, the nesting might be like 2 structures deep. Maybe you're, you're bored and you want to go get drunk, and why? Well, because you don't want to be bored. And if someone pushes you a little farther than that, you hit them. And, you don't want to delve into it. But if you're sophisticated, you have a pretty good hierarchy of answers. So you might say, well, why do you want to be a productive and generous citizen? And like I said, people usually bottom out there, but you could say, well, that's part of reciprocal altruism, and if I'm productive and generous, then that'll encourage other people to be productive and generous, and if we're all productive and generous together, then there'll be more for everyone, and we'll all get along better, and we'll get along for a longer period of time, and that'll make us all more stable, and that'll make our societies better. And then you might say, well, why is that relevant? You might say, well, because the alternative to that is something like a descent into something approximating hell, and so that's part of a reflection of the divine order and the eternal battle between good and evil. And then you could push it farther than that, and you could say, well, are you going to be on the side of the redemptive hero, or are you going to be on the side of the eternal adversary? Like, you can keep digging down farther and farther, and the farther down you dig, the more you get down into what you might describe as the implicit religious substrate. And it's very much useful to know that and to make as much of that conscious as possible. So now imagine that you've come to this talk tonight because you've decided to aim up. And maybe you haven't formulated that precisely explicitly, but something is driving you in this direction. And then you come to the talk and you find out that I'm talking about something that isn't what you expected, and it doesn't seem to be moving you along on your pathway forward to that end. And what's going to happen is you're going to be disappointed. And you might be anxious too. You're going to be disappointed because disappointment signals that you're experiencing something that's not relevant to the goal that you are attempting to pursue, and that might in fact be interfering with it. That's what negative emotion does. And maybe if you're disappointed in what I say, that also makes you anxious because you assumed that you would come here and I would say something relevant, and because you assumed that you knew who I was, and then it turned out that I didn't, and then you don't know who I am, and then you don't know what you're doing here, and then you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because that's what anxiety is for. It tells you when the pathway to your goal has been disrupted, so multiple pathways have now emerged. So imagine you're driving your car to work and it quits. And what happens is you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because, well, you were beetling along quite nicely in your world, and everything was reduced to like a unidimensional simplicity. You weren't in a car as an object, you were in a thing that took you to where you wanted to go, and it was just doing what it was supposed to be doing, tracking you along the pathway to your goal. And then it fails and you're off on the side of the road, and you get anxious because how the hell are you going to get to work? And what if you don't get to work? And is your boss not going to be very happy with you? And maybe this is the 3rd mistake you've made this week. And what if you get fired? And weren't you an idiot for buying this car? Maybe you shouldn't have a car at all. Maybe you should have walked to work. you know, maybe you should take a bicycle because after all, that would save the planet. And, you know, and maybe now you have to take your car to a mechanic, but the last time you went to the mechanic, you got ripped off because you're too stupid about vehicles to manage one, and you're kind of stupid about technology in general, and aren't you stupid? And maybe you're too stupid, and isn't your wife going to... That's anxiety, right? And that's the emergence of a multiplicity of pathways, right? And so what anxiety signifies is the degeneration of an attentional hierarchy into multiplicity. And the reason you get anxious and it feels bad is because now your body can't compute how much energy you have to put out in order to get to your goal. And so you can't organize the world. You're apt to use more resources than you'll replenish. And if you continue to do that, then you'll die. And so anxiety is a signal that complexity has reemerged. Chaos, that's the eternal dragon of chaos. Chaos has reemerged because your narrative has collapsed. And so that's negative emotion. That's what negative emotion signifies, is that it's the collapse of an organizing narrative. And so that's very interesting to know. So you feel positive. If I walk on the stage and I know I'm supposed to go to the front of the stage, say, and the reason I want to do that is because I know I have to talk to you, and that's and I want to talk to you because I think it's valuable to talk to you, etc. That's nested in a hierarchy of value. And if I see a clear pathway to the front of the stage, then that actually produces positive emotion. And that positive emotion impels me forward, because positive emotion does impel you forward. That's what it's for. That's how positive emotion is linked to action. So if you're enthusiastic because you can see a pathway forward to a valued goal, and that enthusiasm manifests itself. This is true even neurochemically. It manifests itself as positive motivation to move forward. And not only that, if you're moving forward and it's working, your brain tracks the fact that it's working, and then that's linked to dopamine release, by the way, which is what cocaine releases. It's linked to dopamine release. And the other thing your brain is doing, even when you're just walking to where you want to go, if you're successfully walking there, your brain tracks what you're doing. There's circuits that are activated while you're doing it. And if what you're doing results in the result you desired, then the dopamine floods those little neurons that are active, and it makes them grow and flourish. And so as you practice something that's working, the circuit that is activated as you're practicing is bathed in dopamine, and that makes it stronger. And that feels good. It's growth. It's part of positive emotion. And so the positive emotion moves you forward, but also encourages you to develop a habit of that practice. And so one of the things I would bloody well say is, don't make a habit of pursuing things that aren't good for you, because you build that into you. That's what happens if you become addicted to something, you know. You build a little monster inside you that's grown. It's there. It's after one goal, despite everything else. Not a good outcome. So now positive emotion also signals the fact that it's also an energy conservation observation. So as I move forward towards my goal, with each step I take, it's going to take less energy to get to the goal. And so that means that positive emotion signifies, what would you say? It signifies the increasing efficiency of your action as you move towards a goal. So negative emotion signifies the fact that things have got too complex for you to manage, and positive emotion signifies that you're approaching your goal and becoming, and that there's less demand on energy output with every step forward. And so that's emotion. And that's pretty much worth knowing. And then what happens when you're watching a movie is you infer the goal of the protagonist, or the villain for that matter. You infer the goal of the character that's being portrayed on the screen. You adopt that goal as your own. Then you play out the emotions in your own body, which mimics the structure what would you call the character that's being portrayed on the screen, and you live that all out inside you. And that's also how you understand other people, right? You don't listen to someone and then figure out what they're saying and then infer what they're thinking. That isn't how it works. What you do is you listen to someone till you figure out what they're up to. As soon as you figure out what they're up to, you can adopt that frame of reference. As soon as you adopt that frame of reference, you have the same emotions. And that's what makes you united. And so that's so interesting. And so then you think, look, there's 5,000 people in here. If there were 5,000 chimpanzees, you guys would be tearing each other into shreds, because no one would be able to know what anyone else was up to. But because all of you are here paying attention to the same thing in the same way, you have virtually identical emotional states, and that means instantly your behavior is rendered predictable to one another. And there's no difference between that and peace. They're the same thing. And so what that means is that one of the predicates of a civil, productive, and peaceful society is that everyone inhabits the same narrative. And you might say, well, we don't need the same narrative. It's like, yes, we do, because if we inhabit a different narrative, then we're running emotionally in different directions, and we will not understand each other, and we will run into conflict, and that conflict can become deadly at the drop of a hat. And so it's a precondition for a civil society that everyone is united in the same narrative. And then that begs the question, right? What is the narrative insofar as we're unified? And another question, which is, what should the narrative be? Right? Now, the postmodernists figured out that we looked at the world through a story, but they said their mantra is they became skeptical of meta-narratives, which are uniting narratives. And that's all well and good to be skeptical about meta-narratives, but you run into the problem of internal disunion, because if you don't have a uniting narrative, then you're divided against yourself, and you run into the problem of social disunity, because if we're not looking at the same thing for the same reason, then we can't get along. And those are big problems. Now, the way the postmodernists glided over that immense cataclysmic problem was to offer the proposition that the narrative that unites us is just one of power and oppression, right? And that the fundamental motivation that guides, first of all, even your internal organization, your own internal tyranny, you know, you're oppressing your id or your natural self. And then if you establish a relationship with someone like a marriage, well, that's just a manifestation of patriarchal oppression. And if you organize a business relationship, it's a relationship of mutual exploitation, and so far and so on, all the way up the political hierarchy, all the way back into the past. A more dismal view of human existence couldn't possibly be formulated. And I always think about it as a kind of implicit confession. It's like, so you think the world's all run by power, do you? Okay, I know what game you're playing and attempting to justify, and it's completely bloody preposterous, because first of all, if you tyrannize yourself, you're going to be one miserable creature. Plus, you're going to rebel constantly, as you already know. I'm sure all of you have tried at one time or another in your life to force yourself to do something with a whip, so to speak, and what you instantly find is that you're so condemned to be free that you'll even resist your own tyranny, right? Try telling yourself to do something and see if you do it. I'm going to go to the gym. That's New Year's. I'm going to the gym 3 times a week, 2 hours a day. It's like, no, you're not. You're going to last like 3 days. And then you're going to find an excuse. The rebellious part of you is going to find an excuse, then you're not going to do it. And it's a bloody mystery, isn't it? Because you'd think you could tell yourself what to do. Because otherwise, who are you? You know, you're the part that told yourself what to do, but you don't listen, so what the hell's that part? That's you, that's for sure. So you can't even tyrannize yourself with any efficiency. And then if you're married, men, you're married, try tyrannizing your wife and see how well that works. And like, it might work for 10 minutes, but she's not as big as you, but she's a lot sneakier. And you have to wake up with her tomorrow morning. And so even if you do win the fight, which you won't, she's going to bloody well take it out on you the next day, and no wonder. And so you're bound in that relationship by the necessity of continual iterative interactions, right? And they have to be moderately peaceful, or you're going to tear each other into shreds. And if it's constant conflict, you're both going to just exhaust yourself and die. So how the hell is that going to work? So it has to be at least mutually reinforcing. And maybe if you really got it together well, you could interact with each other in a way that improved your interactions across time. And maybe you're wise enough so that if you were on that track, the way you would experience that in the moment would be as exactly the kind of relationship you'd want to have with someone. And that would be something like the spirit of play and romantic love. And that would be the manifestation of an instinct that orients you across time properly in a relationship in the moment. And that's such a wonderful thing to know, right? That instinct for play and romantic love might be the voice of the wisest instinct you have, the deepest orientation to meaning that you have. You know, because there's nothing more delightful in a marriage or in a family, if you have children, than to be able to engage in something like voluntary play. And you know, if you could have the world set up the way you would want it to, if you had any sense, wouldn't it be something if mostly what you did was something akin to play? And that's equivalent. Christ in the Gospel says, know that unless you become like a little child, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And what does that mean? It means to rediscover that intense immersion in life and that capacity for play that characterized us all as children, that we can't maintain because we have to mature, but that we could rediscover as adults if we were sufficiently wise and careful. And so, and then, you know, if you have friends, it's like, well, you tyrannize your friends? Well, then you don't have friends. You're just a bully with henchmen. And as soon as you stumble, they're going to stab you in the back because you surrounded yourself with craven psychopaths. They're just going to wait for the moment to take you out. That's not a friendship, obviously. And if you're running a business, and those of you who've run businesses who have a clue know this is true, it's like, what happens if you rip off your customers? Well, you can get away with it once or twice, but word gets around in no time flat, and then you're just done and bitter and resentful because your idiot machinations didn't work. But if you engage in fair trade and you're reliable and you deliver what you promised and you're half decently good to your employees and the people that you work for, then they're going to be pleased with you, and they're going to come back and they're going to talk to their friends about how well you did, and you're going to flourish. And none of that's arbitrary. You know, that's all guided by the manifestation of a certain form of attentional priority, right? You go to your customer's house, maybe you're a plumber, and the first thing you do is you listen to their damn problem. And so at least you have enough sense to engage in dialogos, right? You actually want to hear what the problem is, and then you actually want to solve it. And if you do that with some diligence, they're going to be pleased with you because they don't want sewage all over the rug. And so your interests are aligned, and if you offer what you promise, then you're going to evoke positive emotion in them and quell their anxiety, and that's exactly the service that you're offering. And so that means you're acting out the proper story. You're productive and generous and honest, and there's nothing arbitrary about that as a ethos that unites you internally and that also makes it possible for you to exist in a peaceful and productive society. Are you depressed, or do you just have a horrible life? And those are not the same question, because if you're depressed, you have a life that in principle should work, but isn't. And so you come and say, look, I've got a lot of things going for me. You know, I've got a good job, I've got a good family, my wife loves me, but man, I'm miserable all the time. It's like, okay, well, let's delve into that a bit more deeply. But that kind of sounds like depression. But then you might come and say, well, I'm miserable, I'm suffering, I don't even want to be alive. And then I might ask, well, do you have an intimate partner? Well, no, not really. And I have had a history of catastrophic relationships. Do you have any friends? Well, you know, I have this one person I phone like once every month or so. But other than that, no, I don't really see anyone. Well, do you have any close family? No, my family's pretty fractured. I don't get along with my mom and dad. I don't see my sisters or my siblings much. It's like, well, how about a job? Or how about a career? Or failing that, a job? It's like, well, I've always kind of been underemployed, and I just lost my job, and you know, that's not going very well, and so on. You can walk through someone's life, and you can find out if if what? If they're reasonably embedded in a hierarchy of social institutions. And if the answer is no, no intimate partner, no family, no children, no friends, no job, no career, no educational pathway, no engagement in civic responsibility, let's say, no church attendance, no spiritual life, no routine. It's like, well, you're not depressed, you just have a horrible life. Multidimensionally, like, it's no wonder you're depressed. There's nothing in your life that is working. But it's interesting because that's not exactly a diagnosis at the level of the individual. It's a diagnosis in relationship to the relationship between the individual and this structure of containing social institutions. If you don't have an intimate partner, and you don't have a family, and you don't have any friends, and you don't have a career or a job or any civic involvement or any involvement, let's say, with religious institutions, and you don't have any creative striving, all you've got left is pain. And so that's what you have. And so here's a different way of thinking about sanity. Sanity isn't being well constituted as an atomized individual. Sanity is what makes itself manifest if you're properly situated in a hierarchy of social order. To be well constituted, you have to be a harmonious player in a multidimensional symphony in some real sense of social interaction. It's very hard to stay on the straight and narrow without a partner who doesn't share your blind spots, correcting you constantly. You know, now that's annoying. There's a tussling about it, right? There's a fractious and adversarial element to that, because if you're married, you don't see eye to eye, and thank God for that, because sometimes in your foolish insistence on being right, you're wrong, and wrong in a way that'll take you out. And so you better have a partner who doesn't think the same way you do. And fortunately, if you have a partner, you have a partner who doesn't think the same way you do. And so if you can get the dialogue flowing, then that's a mutually corrective mechanism. And so then you might say, well, the truthful dialogue between partners in a marriage is actually, it's the process by which sanity itself is generated. And I mean technically, it's like you're too complex to regulate yourself, period. And so you need other people to help you do that. So if you have a wife or a husband, someone who knows you and is there for the long run, they can help, you can help each other find the meaningful path and stay on it. And you can't do that alone. And probably just having a partner isn't enough. You need kids, likely, to keep you sane or to drive you crazy, depending on the nature of your children. Let's say you need family, you need your parents, you need your siblings, you need another community around you that's not merely your wife, because you're so crazy that it takes a village to keep you sane. And so, and then surrounding that more intimate web of kinship, you need friends. And friends keep you sane. Well, how? Well, you have to act in a manner that makes them want to be around you to have friends. And that means that to maintain your friendships, you have to be saner than you really are, right? You have to be, they have to be able to enjoy their time with you. If you practice forthright and voluntary exposure to that which terrifies and dismays you, it transforms you. And we really know this as psychologists. We even know there's more and more evidence suggesting, for example, that if you imagine you adopt this attitude of voluntary confrontation, that changes you psychophysiologically. So much of the biochemistry of motivation and emotion is transformed when you take a stressor which could be oppressive and paralyze you and cause you to withdraw, and you reverse that and you decide to advance. It's like a different spirit inhabits you, and I mean this physiologically. There's a whole different pattern of being that makes itself manifest in you neurologically and psychophysiologically and pharmacologically. So you take it on as a challenge, right? And that transforms you at a cellular level too, because one of the things we've discovered in recent years is that if you do something new and complex, then that turns on that parts of your DNA that haven't produced proteins before will start producing new proteins and reconstruct you from the cellular level up. So it's a deep transformation, and we have no idea how deep. And again, you could ask yourself, if you didn't withdraw in fear from anything from everything that life threw at you, who could you become? And I would say that's the central religious question in some real deep sense. You know, are more things thrown at us than we can manage? Well, that's a tricky question, because pretty dreadful things are thrown our way. And you might say, well, that's just presents an insuperable barrier to progress. That's not very helpful, because you're alive, here you are, you got these problems to contend with, and if it's an impossible task, then how could you be anything but hopeless and desperate? But then you think, well, wait a second, how would things transform if I took this on as a voluntary adventure, you know, regardless of its scope? And the scope would include unjust suffering, death, and hell. And that's not just some religious or metaphysical vision. It's like, no, you're actually going to have to contend with that in your life, in whatever way those things make themselves manifest to you personally. That's coming, man. And so maybe you better get prepared. And then the question might be, well, what would happen if you got prepared? And the answer might be, you'd be prepared. And I think the religious enterprise in its deepest sense is that process of preparation. And you know, you might want to even push that a bit farther. You might say, well, not only do you want to get prepared for what's coming your way, but you want to be so prepared that when it comes your way, that it doesn't make you bitter and resentful and tempted by the desire to walk the path that would make all of that even worse. And so you might say, well, if you could really face up to what you need to face up to, not only could you turn yourself into someone that could bear the catastrophe of life and exposure to hell, but maybe you could turn yourself into someone who would still do good even while facing those things. And that's a pretty noble goal. So one of the pathways that's on display with regards to the formulation of an identity, let's say, is this injunction, which is really a temptation to love yourself. So we should take that apart. Now, the first question might be, well, what do you mean by yourself? And one answer to that is the person I am now. And you should love and feel good about the person you are now. And that's actually a dubious proposition for a variety of reasons. One is, whatever yourself is not only what you are. Yourself is also what you could become, and what you will and could become. And so to love yourself properly is not only to love what you are, who you are, whatever that means, but to love who you could become. Now, one of the things I've observed is that it's very demoralizing, let's say, for the typical young man. It's true for the typical young woman as well. So we'll say the typical young person who's miserable and maladjusted psychologically and socially, if you just go to them and say, well, you should feel good about yourself, because they think you're good just the way you are. You're perfect just the way you are. You should accept yourself just the way you are. It's like, well, okay, so what does that say about who I should become? Is that just now off the table because I'm already good enough in every way? So am I done or something? What about who I should become? And then, well, how should I feel good about myself when I don't? Because I'm not getting along with myself, I'm anxious and hopeless and nihilistic and depressed, and I'm not getting along with other people. So how is it that that's all somehow something I should feel good about without being deluded? And these are complicated questions because you don't want to beat yourself with a stick, which might be the opposite of that. So I'll feel bad about yourself. It's like, no, be judicious and merciful with yourself and think that you need to accept yourself in some way, the way a mother accepts a child. But the maternal spirit is not the only spirit that governs the love that a child requires properly. You have the paternal spirit of encouragement as well, which is, well, we need to shelter and protect you and to provide for your security the way you are, but you could be a lot better and should be, and I have faith that you could be, which is the love that I'm delivering to what you're becoming rather than what you are. And so love that you direct towards yourself is partly directed towards that maternal care that's sort of the minimum precondition for basic flourishing, combined with an attitude of encouragement towards the possibilities of your being. And so that's a much more sophisticated so-called self-love, partly because it's the kind of love that envisions you as something that unfolds across time. And it's a much richer conception because it also implies that there's a responsible adventure to your life. Like you're not all you could be, and there's pain in that, and there's the necessity for a certain amount of judgment about that, and even a certain amount of exclusion, because what you are that is insufficient in some sense should not be allowed to propagate further. But if it's conjoined with encouragement, it's like, yeah, you're in a rough situation there, kiddo, but you know, here's some things about you that are virtuous and good, and they're pretty powerful actually, and if you just made those more manifest, you could dispense with a lot of this immaturity and misery, and you could expand yourself out into life physically and psychologically, and you could start walking this pathway that makes things better. And the thing is that as soon as you start walking the pathway that makes things better, then things immediately become better because your whole orientation changes. And you know, if you're in a bad place but you're escaping, that's pretty positive, even if it's a bad place. And you might think, well, it's still bad, but it's better. It's like, well, that's a lot better than a bad place that's getting worse. That's for sure, because that's hell. Hell is a bad place that's getting worse. That's for sure. And so if you take the bad place and it's getting better, well, it's already not hell. That's a start. And so this notion of love, we've confused this with the maternal instinct for an infant. It's like, because an infant under 6 months is like, well, of course, your attitude towards an infant is you're exactly okay the way you are, in the sense that there's nothing to do with an infant under 6 months in the most fundamental sense, except to provide them with total care. But that's not what you do to any child that's older than 6 months. You start laying down some criteria for becoming, for improvement. And some of that improvement, because we can define it, well, there's nothing more perfect than a child, than a baby. It's like, yeah, but that's not true if the baby's 14 years old, right? It's true if the baby's 6 months old and actually a baby. But by 9 months, well, the child is going to start to interact socially. And now there's some principles that the child has to learn to abide by so that social interaction is optimized. And then you want to replace the infant with the toddler who has a certain domain of autonomy and responsibility and a certain capacity for social interaction. And you want to replace the toddler with the young child, with the preschooler, who now can negotiate a shared social space. And you want to replace the preschooler with the older child who's now capable of taking on as much domestic responsibility as is appropriate for that age. You want to take the infant who's entirely dependent and turn them into something that's autonomous and then socially integrated, and then socially integrated in a manner that's moving them towards individual responsibility. And the love is not only love that's devoted to what they are at any point, which is that encompassing maternal love, say, but the love that says, yeah, kid, you know, we're pretty happy you're around, but the new you is going to even be better. And that's encouragement, and that's
part of love. It's half of love, that's for sure. And you want to direct that to yourself as well. It's like, you don't want to judge who you are so harshly that you just destroy yourself and everything is cast into the pit. You want to take a look at yourself and say, look, you know, you're a person among persons and you have intrinsic worth and you have your flaws, your sins, your domain of ignorance and inadequacy. But that doesn't mean that you're entirely worthless because of that. You have a base level value. That's the intrinsic worth, let's say, that's reflective of the fact that you're made in the divine image in the most fundamental sense. You have intrinsic worth, and that's due a certain degree of baseline love. But there's the becoming problem. It's like, well, especially when you're young, most of you is still in the becoming phase. And so why wouldn't encouragement be the hallmark of love? It's like, get the hell up, get your act together, adopt some responsibility, put your life together, develop a vision, expand yourself beyond the narrow confines that are causing your misery. And we think you can do it. You could do it, you should do it, the world would be better off if you did it, you'd be doing better if you did it, everything would work out better. Why would we not work to make everything work out better? And you're the person who could do it. And you tell young people that and they think, well, no one ever told me that before in that way. And they think, well, maybe I should get my act together. And then they go out and try to get their act together in some micro ways. And they think, well, turned out that worked and I'm less miserable. I could try doing it a little bit on a broader scale. And they try that and they think, wow, people seem a lot happier with me. I have more friends and I'm more popular and I'm a little more physically attractive because I'm standing up a little bit straighter. And then away they go. And why would you, unless you believe that human being is corrupt and pathological in its essence, which many people now seem to believe, or at least some dread spirit seems to insist, and people agree with it. If you don't buy that, then you think, well, yeah, you unfold, man. Unfold all those manifold possibilities that lurk within and be a force for good in the world. And that'll be the adventure of your life. And I guess we could also add to that a bit of a disquisition on truth. So you should be oriented by love. And you could say, well, that's the desire to care for being and becoming, however it's manifest, to want that to turn out in the best possible manner. That could be your goal. I want things to turn out in the best possible manner. And you have to decide if that's true, because people are tempted to create little hells around them all the time. So don't be thinking that necessarily you want that, because it's not that easy to orient yourself so that that's all you want, because you're bitter and resentful and angry. And so all of that's going to interfere with that vision of love. And then you might say, well, now that you have that vision, what do you have as weapons to clear your path, let's say, or to set things in order as you move forward? And one of the answers to that is, we have truth. Well, why? Well, because you want to contend with the world the way it is, obviously. So truth is going to be useful in that endeavor. And then you might say, well, if I could get away with something by not telling the truth, why shouldn't I just lie? If I could get what I wanted and if I could avoid responsibility, why not lie? And the first answer is, well, what makes you so sure you want to avoid responsibility, except narrowly in this moment, because it's not a good medium to long-term strategy and everyone knows it. And what makes you think that manipulating people in the short term so that you can gratify a whim is going to be a useful iterative strategy? It's like, it's not. So you can dispense with that. And so what do you do when you tell the truth? Instead, is you predicate your actions on an axiom of faith, which is that nothing better can happen than that which happens if you live in truth. And that's a statement of deep religious faith, because the evidence for that can only be gathered as a consequence of manifesting the actions that are predicated upon that axiom of faith. You don't know till you lay it out. But you can say, well, I believe that the truth will set me free. And then you think, well, the truth will set me free. Who's me? Back to identity. Well, if you're lying, it's not you by definition, because if you're lying, you're attempting to implement a falsehood. You're attempting to falsify the world and yourself. That's what a lie is. And so if something happens that's good because you lied, it's not happening to you. It's a reward for the spirit of deceit that you allowed to inhabit you. And if you reward the spirit of deceit that you allowed to inhabit you, it will grow. And I would not recommend that. That's a very bad idea. In the contrary situation, you live and speak in truth, and then things happen. They're happening to you. That's your life, man. That's your adventure. And one of the things that's very interesting about the truth in that regard is that it provides a certain optimal unpredictability. You know, if you're talking to someone, you think maybe you're being interviewed, or maybe you're having a discussion with someone, you think, I'd like to impress this person. It's like now you have a little vision of what the instrumental outcome of the conversation could be, so that it reflects positively on some narrow conception of a desired future state. I want this person to be impressed with me, so I'm only going to say things they want to hear and that sound impressive. That's all lies. It's like, well, maybe you'll get that result, but it won't be what you want because it's predicated on a falsehood. Instead, you could just have a conversation with the person, like a real conversation. It's like, what do you think? Here's what I think. Do you like it or not like it? It's like, well, I don't know if you like it or not like it. It's like, we can talk about that and why, but it's still what I think. And that doesn't mean it's right, but it's what I think. Well, then you lay that out, and then what happens to you is what happens to you. And then it's unpredictable, because imagine you're speaking deceitfully and instrumentally. You want something from someone. Okay, well then you're lying, so the you that receives is not you. It's the spirit of deceit. And it's also, you're instrumental because you think that that narrow vision is optimal, even though it requires deceit. You can just throw that away and you can say, well, I'm going to say what I think, carefully and judiciously, feeling out the words, and then I'm going to accept whatever happens, no matter how unpredictable. And then what you'll find is that's where you have adventure. Because you might ask too, well, what do you have to offset against the catastrophe of life? Responsibility, friendship, place, job, career, education, all of that. Adventure. Adventure. Is the adventure worth it? Well, if you tell the truth, you will have the adventure of your life. That's what will happen.
Put yourself together. And then maybe if you put yourself together, you know how to do that. You know what's wrong with you, if you'll admit it. You know there's a few things you could like polish up a little bit, that you might even be able to manage in your insufficient present condition. And so you might shine yourself up a little bit, and then your eyes will be a little more open, then you can shine yourself up a little bit more, and then maybe you could bring your family together instead of having them be the hateful, spiteful, neurotic, infighting batch that you're like doomed to spend Christmas with. So then you fix yourself up a little bit, and then you got to figure out, well, can you figure out how to make peace with your idiot brother? And probably not, because he's just as dumb as you, so how the hell are you going to manage that? And so then maybe you get somewhere that way, and your family's sort of functioning, and you find out, well, that kind of relieved a little bit of suffering, although it reduced the opportunities for spiteful revenge, and that's kind of a pain in the neck. And so then you get your family together a little bit, and you're a little clued in then, at least a bit, because you've done something difficult that's actually difficult. You're a little wiser, and so then maybe you could put a tentative finger out beyond the family and try to change some little thing without wrecking it. So, and that's the other message of the West. It's like, how do you overcome the suffering of life? And I'm not saying it's only the message of the West. How do you overcome the suffering of life? Is be a better person. That's how you do it. Well, that's hard. It takes responsibility. And I think, you know, if you said to someone, you want to have a meaningful life? Everything you do matters. That's the definition of a meaningful life. But everything you do matters. You're going to have to carry that with you. Or do you want to just forget about the whole meaning thing, and then you don't have any responsibility, because who the hell cares? And you can wander through life doing whatever you want, gratifying impulsive desires for how useful that's going to be. And you're stuck in meaninglessness, but you don't have any responsibility. Which one do you want? Well, ask yourself, which one are you pursuing? And you'll find very rapidly that it isn't the majority of your soul that's pursuing the whole meaning thing, because, well, look what you have to do that. You have to take on the fact that life is suffering. You have to put yourself together in the face of that. Well, that's hard. Christ, it's amazing people can even do it. I'm stunned every day when I go outside. and it isn't a riot with everything burning. There's all these ruined people out there. They've got problems like you can't believe. Off they go to work and do things they don't even like, and look, the lights are on. It's a miracle, and we're so ungrateful. College students, the postmodern types, they're so ungrateful. You know, they don't know that they're surrounded by just a bloody miracle. It's a miracle that all this stuff works, that all you crazy chimpanzees that don't know each other can sit in the same room for 2 hours sweltering away without tearing each other apart, because that's what chimps do. Anyways, so I got to the bottom of some things, at least as far as I can tell, so I told you what the bottom is, and then I got this idea about what you might do about it, which isn't my idea. It's an old idea. It's far older than Christianity. It's old. It's the oldest story of mankind. Get yourself together. Transcend your suffering. See if you can be some kind of hero. Make the suffering in the world less. Well, that's the way forward, as far as I can tell, if there is any way forward.
Live without it.
Assuming you want to get better, there's usually something you can figure out that would constitute a step towards some sort of concrete goal. And my presumption, it's a behavioral presumption fundamentally, is that small accruing gains that repeat are unbelievably powerful. You can tyrannize yourself into doing things, but I wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend it instead is that you ask yourself what you're willing to do. It's a really effective technique. It's like a meditative technique. So for example, you can get up in the morning and you can think, well, you know, I'd like to have a good day today, so I'd like to go to bed tonight without feeling guilty because I, you know, didn't do some things I said I was going to do, and I'd like to have kind of an interesting day. So you got to fulfill my responsibilities, and I want to, enjoy the day. Then you can ask yourself, well, what would I have to do in order for that to happen that I would do? And the probability, if you practice this for 3 or 4 days, is your brain will just tell you, it'll say, well, there's that piece of homework that you haven't done for like 3 weeks, you should knock that sucker off because it would only take you 10 minutes and you've been avoiding it and torturing yourself to death for 72 hours straight. And say, well, let's figure out what your aims are. You got to have some aims, whatever they are. And they might say, well, I'm so depressed I don't have any aims. And then I say, well, pick the least objectionable of the aims and act it out for a while and see what happens. Because sometimes your emotional systems are so fouled up that you have to pretend. You have to act the thing out before you can start to believe it. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. I thought, God, that's such a good idea. Because it's not optimistic exactly. Some people will tell you, well, you can be happy. It's like, those people are idiots. I'm telling you, they're idiots. There's going to be things that come along that flatten you so hard you won't believe it. And you're not happy then. And so if life is to be happy, well, in those situations, what are you doing? Why even live? But life isn't to be happy. If you're happy, you're bloody fortunate, and you should enjoy it. You should, because it's the grace of God, so to speak. People know when they're doing something meaningful. They can tell, so why the hell don't they do meaningful things all the time? It seems obvious. You could do it. I mean, it's hard, because other people want you to do other things, and it's a struggle, but everything's a struggle. Oh, I get it. I see why. It took me about 10 years to figure this out. People have a choice. Choice number 1. Nothing you do means anything. Well, that's kind of a drag, right? It's the meaninglessness of life and all that, existential angst. That's kind of a pain. But the upside of nothing that you do is meaningful is you don't have to do anything. You've got no responsibility. Now, you have to suffer because things are meaningless, but that's a small price to pay. The alternative is everything you do matters. Really. If you make a mistake, it's a real mistake. If you betray someone, you tilt the world a little more sharply towards evil rather than good. It matters what you do. Well, if you buy that, then you can have a meaningful life. But there's no mucking around. It means responsibility. It means that the decisions you make are important. It means that when you do something wrong, it's wrong. Well, do you want that? We should make a very clear distinction here that often when people are embittered and resentful and feel like they're victims, it's because really awful things have happened to them. Now, not always, but often. And so then the question is, well, if you're in a situation and something really awful is happened to you or has happened to you, then, well, why shouldn't you feel like a victim? And is there a better alternative? And part of what you were trying to lay out in this part of the book is what those better alternatives are. So part of looking for that hero is to find out from someone else's example. In your case, it was your mother, but these other sources that you described, of people who were in a sort of hell in an undeniable sense, but who chose in a very real way to make it as good as it could possibly be given the circumstances. And so they had to turn to sources of power, let's say, and strength and fortitude and resilience that weren't, in some sense, obviously associated with the catastrophe. I mean, in your mother's case, it's a pretty tragic situation. She's a young mother, she has young kids, now she has breast cancer, and she fights a losing battle over a period of 5 years. That's pretty bad. And then you have to ask yourself, given that that's obviously pretty bad, how is it even possible that someone could handle that with not only grace and courage, but the kind of grace and courage that leaves their children with an immovable sense of the ability to prevail in the face of the deepest adversity? I mean, that's really something. You said here, thousands have come before you and they did just fine. So quit your complaining. And it's not because you have nothing to complain about. That's not the case. It's that that's not the right approach. The fact is, and this is such an optimistic fact, as well as a judgment in some sense, the fact is that if someone else can do it, so can you. And that's something, right? If you're reading about the great heroes in history, people who are in these terrible situations, and you see someone rise to the occasion, and then you can say, well, that was a person who did that, and I'm a person, and so maybe I have that capacity too, even though I don't know how to approach it. And then some of the rest of your book, much of the rest of your book, I would say in some sense is a guide to help people figure out how they could approach that. One of the things you point out first is, well, notice who you admire. And then maybe try consciously practicing becoming like that.
And you know, people are very, 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 very tough. And it turns out that if you face things, that you can put up with a lot more than you think you can put up with, and you can do it without becoming corrupted. And she did recover quite fully, and much as a consequence of her own machinations, because she figured out what was wrong with her and then took the necessary steps to fix it, which is nothing short of a bloody miracle as far as I'm concerned. And anyways, part of the cat bit is, I actually start by talking about our dog, who actually died about a year ago, but he's still alive in the book. I let people know, because dog lovers love dogs, and if you love cats, then they think you don't like dogs, and then they think they don't like you. So I also point out at the beginning of the chapter that, if you want to pet a dog on the street, that's okay too, so you don't have to get up in arms about it. But the idea is that, you have to be alert when you're suffering. You have to be alert to the beauty in life, the unexpected beauty in life. And that's kind of what I was trying to get across with the idea of the cat. There's this cat that lives across the street from us called Ginger, and Ginger's a Siamese cat. And cats really aren't domesticated, technically speaking. They're still wild animals, but they kind of like people. God only knows why, but they do, And so Ginger will come wandering over, and our dog looks at her, but they're friends, and she rolls over on his back, and Seiko used to, nose her a bit, and then she'd kind of mosey over and let you pet her if she was feeling like it that day. And, you have to look for that little bit of sparkling crystal in the darkness when things are bad. You have to look and see where things are still beautiful and where there's still something that's sustaining. And you narrow your time frame and you be grateful for what you have, and that can get you through some very dark times, and maybe even successfully if you're lucky. But even if unsuccessfully, then maybe it's only tragic and not absolute hell. And you can do that, in the worst situation. You can make it only tragic and not hell. And there's a big gap between tragedy and hell. There's nothing worse at a deathbed than to see the people there fighting. The death is bad enough,
But you can take that, as terrible as it is, and make it into something that's absolutely unbearable. And maybe, I think, and this is sort of what I closed the book with, this idea is that if we didn't all attempt to make terrible things even worse than they are, then maybe we could tolerate the terrible things that we have to put up with in order to exist, and maybe we could make the world into a better place, you know. And it's what we should be doing and what we could be doing, because we don't have anything better to do. And that's what the book is about. And that's the end of 12 Rules for Life. If you're thinking about your past, what it means is you haven't analyzed the causal chains. Because you might say, well, why do you remember your past? Well, you might say, well, it's in order to have an objective, you know, record of the past. It's like it has nothing to do with that. There's only one reason you remember the past, and that's to be prepared for the future. That's why you remember the past. And so what you're supposed to do is take the past and extract out from it wisdom. And wisdom is the ability to avoid stumbling blindly into ditches. Here's a time in my past I stumbled blindly into this horrible ditch and terrible things happened to me. You need to take that apart. You need to figure out, how was it that events conspired with your participation, voluntarily or involuntarily, so that that terrible consequence emerged. You need to know why that happened and how you could react differently in that situation. And as soon as you do that, your brain will leave it alone. It won't obsess you about it anymore, because the anxiety-producing parts of your brain are basically trying to tell you where there are obstacles in your environment. Don't go there, there's fire. Maybe you could master the fire, right? Then you're a wielder of fire, you're not just a victim. And lots of situations are dangerous or not dangerous depending on your level of mastery, right? I mean, life is like that. And so a negative emotion that's associated with a memory is something that's crying out for mastery, and writing can really help with that. You're reorganizing your brain when you write autobiographically. Imagine emotion, memories can be stored at different levels of your brain, from sort of primordial reptilian image-laden areas that are very emotional, up to finely articulated plans for your future life. Well, you want to take everything that's negative and emotional and transform that into a fully articulated vision for your future. And that frees you of your past. You shouldn't be thinking about your past. I mean, maybe if you're 80 and, you know, you're going over a well-spent life, that's a whole different thing. But if you're 30, 35, or 20, and most of the time you're thinking about your past, it's like your soul is trapped back there. You need to free it through investigation. And the metaphysical language is appropriate, because that is, in a sense, what you're doing. You're trapped in the past. It's like you got to break free of that so you can use all your resources to move ahead into the future. Imagine someone that you treat well, that you love. Then try to treat yourself that way. You got to detach from yourself a bit. You got to think, okay, well, I'm a person among other people, and I deserve at least as much respect as a person among other people, and I should be trying to help myself across time. And instead of being self-contemptuous and self-destructive, I need to take care of myself as if I'm potentially valuable, and to lay out my life that way. And so that's what that chapter is about. And it's hard for people, you know. They don't take care of themselves as well as they should. And I don't mean, you know, take care of yourself. I mean, that isn't what I mean. It's like, it's not a moralistic attack. It's like, it's an encouragement to give yourself a bit of the benefit of the doubt. Take care of your room, take care of your things, like have some respect for yourself. It's like there is a lot of potential within you, and there's many things that you can do, and you're necessary more than you think to the unfolding of things. Like, if you make a bunch of bad decisions, things get worse, not just for you, like things get worse. And so it matters what you do, and so part of what you do is you want to treat yourself as if what you do matters. And so you want to have some respect for yourself. Young people like to think about ways to change the world, right? And that's actually a positive part of their development. It's a stage that the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget called the messianic stage, and he associated that with late adolescence. While young people want to change the world, the problem is that that's been harnessed into attempts to change other people. But that isn't what you should do. If you want to change the world, you should change yourself. In the sense that Alexander Solzhenitsyn said when he analyzed the Soviet Union, he said, don't be thinking that the line that divides good from evil runs down a political spectrum or countries or something like that. It runs down right down the middle of your soul. And if you want to sort out the world, then what you do is you sort yourself out. It's a serious business. They say it's more difficult to rule yourself than to rule a city, because you're complicated and there are horrible monsters inside of you that need to be tamed and to be brought into alignment and submission so that you can be a powerful and useful person. And instead of rushing out there to change the world by changing other bad people, that they should look inward and sort themselves out properly. And if you have a memory that's more than 18 months old, approximately, and when you pull that memory up to mind, if you still have an emotional reaction, that means you haven't fully articulated the memory. You haven't analyzed it causally. You haven't freed yourself from its grasp, and you're carrying it like a weight. And your brain responds to that. Like the more weight you're carrying like that, more baggage, let's say, the more of the stress hormone cortisol your brain produces. And cortisol makes you old. Divide your life up into 6 epochs. And then divide each of those, that might be, say, birth to kindergarten, and then maybe elementary school, and then maybe junior high school, however you want to do it. And then to write about the emotionally significant events in each of those epochs, and then to describe their effects on you, and then to analyze how you did in those situations, what you might have done differently, what you might do differently in the future, to straighten out your past. And you know, people are very, 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 very tough. And it turns out that if you face things, that you can put up with a lot more than you think you can put up with, and you can do it without becoming corrupted. And she did recover quite fully, and much as a consequence of her own machinations, because she figured out what was wrong with her and then took the necessary steps to fix it, which is nothing short of a bloody miracle as far as I'm concerned. And anyways, part of the cat bit is I actually start by talking about our dog, who actually died about a year ago, but he's still alive in the book. I let people know, because dog lovers love dogs, and if you love cats, then they think you don't like dogs, and then they don't like you. So I also point out at the beginning of the chapter that, if you want to pet a dog on the street, that's okay too, so you don't have to get up in arms about it. But the idea is that, you have to be alert when you're suffering. You have to be alert to the beauty in life, the unexpected beauty in life. And that's kind of what I was trying to get across with the idea of the cat. There's this cat that lives across the street from us called Ginger, and Ginger's a Siamese cat. And cats really aren't domesticated, technically speaking. They're still wild animals, but they kind of like people. God only knows why, but they do, And so Ginger will come wandering over, and our dog looks at her, but they're friends, and she rolls over on his back, and Seiko used to, nose her a bit, and then she'd kind of mosey over and let you pet her if she was feeling like it that day. And, you have to look for that little bit of sparkling crystal in the darkness when things are bad. You have to look and see where things are still beautiful and where there's still something that's sustaining. And, you narrow your time frame and you be grateful for what you have, and that can get you through some very dark times, and maybe even successfully if you're lucky. But even if unsuccessfully, then maybe it's only tragic and not absolute hell. And you can do that, in the worst situation. You can make it only tragic and not hell. And there's a big gap between tragedy and hell. There's nothing worse at a deathbed than to see the people there fighting. The death is bad enough, but you can take that, as terrible as it is, and make it into something that's absolutely unbearable. And maybe I think, and this is sort of what I closed the book with, this idea is that if we didn't all attempt to make terrible things even worse than they are, then maybe we could tolerate the terrible things that we have to put up with in order to exist, and maybe we could make the world into a better place, and it's what we should be doing and what we could be doing, because we don't have anything better to do. And that's what the book is about. And in the future authoring program, which is the one we've done the most research on, so if people do this for 90 minutes badly before they go to college, it'll decrease the probability they'll drop out in the first year by 50%.
That's amazing.
And it works particularly well for people who are most likely to drop out. So a lot of psychological interventions help the good performers do even better and don't help the bad performers that much.
And why do you think it helps them more?
Well, I think the good performers already have a bit of a vision and a plan, whereas the bad performers, they're really ambivalent about what they're doing because they don't have a plan. And we'll talk more about why this is so important. So if you don't have a reason to do something, and then a reason not to do it comes up, well, then you'll just not do it, because not doing things is real easy. You can just sit there and not do things all day. Doing things takes effort, and so any resistance is likely to, it pushes back against you. And so going to college, it's like, well, why is that difficult? Well, you have to get up, you have to go to your classes, you have to do the assignments, you have to do the reading, you have to write the tests, you have to believe that this path is somehow better than any other path you could be on, and there's innumerable other paths, and that it's better in some fundamental sense than just doing nothing or playing games or being purely hedonic. So there's a lot of, because it's difficult, there's a lot of obstacles. And if you don't have a reason, well, why would you overcome the obstacles? And so what happens when you do the future authoring program is two things. Is first of all, you construe yourself as the sort of person who could have a reason, right? Who could make a vision and impose it on the world.
And how do you do that?
Well, and then second, you actually develop a vision. Okay, so the first thing the program asks you to do, and it's got a biblical element to it in some fundamental sense, although that wasn't so explicit when we first developed it, but I came to realize that later. There's a statement in the Gospels. Christ says to his followers, ask and you'll receive. Knock and the door will open. Seek and you'll find. And you listen to that and you think, no way, man, it can't be that easy. Well, it's that easy. Because let's think about what wanting means. You want something. You want to find, so you'll seek. How hard are you going to seek? You know, maybe you're after the Holy Grail, right? Or you're after the gold in the dragon's lair, or the jewel in the toad's head. You're after something that's guarded by some monstrous figure. You're going to seek? How committed to that are you? And there's a total commitment in that in a fundamental way. It's like you should be humble enough to be open to learning, to radical transformation, to the probability that you're really wrong if you're not finding what you're seeking, and the willingness to sacrifice virtually everything of lesser value for that goal. Otherwise, you do not want it. You did not ask. You are not seeking. You did not knock on the door. Well, this is the development of a vision. Now, you can construe consciousness as the implementer of the vision in the broadest sense. So what we really confront as human beings isn't a deterministic world that runs like clockwork, that the past pushes forward in an algorithmic or deterministic manner. That isn't how the world works. The way the world works is that we confront a horizon of possibility that's not predictable. It's somewhat predictable the way a musical piece is predictable. So it's rule governed, but it's not predictable in a deterministic way. And it's full of possibility and potential. That's actually its nature. It's potential in its nature. And to maximize the quality of our interaction with that potential, we have to impose a vision on it and then pursue the vision. And so when you do the future authoring program, well, that's what you're trying to do, is develop a vision. So here's the first exercise. It's like, okay, here's the deal, all right? You get to have what you need and what you want. Maybe even better, you get to have what you need and want if you were treating yourself properly. So imagine, first of all, that you were treating yourself properly because you actually cared for yourself.
Okay, and say you don't.
Yeah, well, you don't.
How do you help somebody?
Well, you at least ask them to open the door to the possibility that maybe they could. So just imagine that you did. Not that you are, that you could, but that you tried. You think, okay, I'm a valuable person, maybe, and if I was treating myself like I had intrinsic value, like if you were treating yourself like you were someone you loved, so you could imagine doing this for someone you actually cared about. Because most people care about someone that isn't them.
So do you identify someone you care about?
Well, you can, yes, you can say, because it does tell you. It's like, well, if you're not so good at caring for yourself, imagine someone you love and then pretend that you're bringing that attitude to bear on you with all your faults and inadequacies. I'm not being casual about this. It's hard for people to do this, right? Because we know our own flaws so deeply. It's hard for us to take care of ourselves. But imagine that you should take care of yourself and that you could and that you did. Just imagine that. So that's opening up at least the door, right?
Yeah.
And then you say, well, 5 years down the road, you get to have what you want and need. What is it? And so this is a deep question. So, because the question is this: your life is going to be difficult, and it's going to be marked by suffering and tragedy in all sorts of different ways. Disappointment and obstacle and betrayal and the whole panoply of human catastrophe. That's absolutely 100% definitely coming your way. Okay, so given that, and given that you want to live a life free of resentment and bitterness and premature aging and excess suffering, and that you don't want to be a burden to everyone around you, what would you have to make carrying that weight worthwhile? That's a hard question, you know. It's like, what justifies your suffering? That isn't how am I going to be happy. It's what justifies your suffering. Well, ask yourself. You get to have what you want. If you were taking care of yourself, what would it be? Okay, and so you write for 15 minutes about what your life might be like 5 years down the road if you got to have what you needed and wanted. And then we concretize it. You know, I had lots of clients and students who said, well, I don't know what to do with my life. What should I do with my life? And the first answer to that question is, that's not a very good question. Because it's like, what, do you want a one-line answer to what you should do with your life? Like, life is everything, and you want a one-line answer to everything. No. Bad question. You can imagine a desirable future, but it helps to particularize it. So one of the things you might ask is, where do people find meaning? And the answer is, well, in multiple places. Here's some places people typically find meaning. So if clients came to me and they were depressed, first of all, I'd try to find out, are you depressed? Or do you just have a terrible life, or some combination of those two? And you might ask, what's the difference? And that's a really good question. If you're depressed, you have a good life, but you're suffering. So what would it mean that you have a good life? Well, it means somewhat different things to different people, but you can kind of triangulate on it. Probably you have an intimate relationship, or at least you have the prospects of one. So at least you want one, and you believe that maybe you could have one if you don't have one, and probably if you have a good life, you have one. You have some friends. They're real friends, right? You have some family members, children, perhaps, if not children, parents and siblings, or perhaps both, grandchildren. You're nested inside a family, and your relationships with your family are desirable. You have a job or a career, and so if it's a job, well, then it's hard, and maybe you wouldn't have picked it as a vocation, but at least maybe you have good relationships with your coworkers, and you're doing something difficult, but that's actually socially productive and useful and generates an income. So that's not nothing. You're educated to the level of your intellectual capability, or you have plans to do so. You're taking care of yourself mentally and physically, and you have a strategy for dealing with the realm of signal temptation, drug and alcohol abuse and sexual misbehavior and that sort of thing. And then we've added one more recently, at least conceptually, that you've adopted a certain degree of civic responsibility, right? You're participating in the broader community in some manner. And if you're doing none of those, my life is meaningless. Are you doing any of these? No. Well, that's why it's meaningless. Those are the domains of meaning. And so, if you're miserable and you have none of those things, the first thing to do, if you're a cognitive behavioral therapist with someone, is to say, well, how about we work on like one of these things to begin with? You know, you need some friends. You need to get out in the dating market. You need a job or a better job. You need an educational plan. Like, you don't have a life, so of course you're miserable, because without sustaining life, without sustaining meaning, life is just tragedy. And so your lot is misery. And so anyways, we ask people to go through these 8 different domains and say, okay, you can have what you want, but you have to aim at it. Sin means to miss the mark, by the way. It means to miss the target. That's what takes you away from God, is to miss the target. What target? Yeah! Right! What target? Right! You got to at least know there's a target, then you got to try to hit it. You know, and maybe you don't even know where the target is, but your aim isn't good, but at least you've set up a target now, and you can practice. And so, well, if you had an intimate relationship, what would it look like? If you had some friends, how would you like those friendships to be conducted? If you had a job or a career, what could it be if you had what you wanted? And it's also very much worth thinking about with regards to setting up your life in general. It's like, if you concentrate solely on your career, you can get a long way in your career. And I would say that that's a strategy that a minority of men preferentially do. That's all they do. They work like 70, 80 hours a week. They go flat out on their career. They're staking everything on the small probability of exceptional status in a narrow domain. But it's hard on them. They don't have a life. It's very difficult for them to have a family. They don't know how to take any leisure activity. Like, they get very one-dimensional. Now, it may be that unidimensionality is the price you have to pay to be exceptional at one thing, right? Because if you're going to be something like a genius level mathematician, and you want to do that or a scientist, say, it's like you're in your lab all the time, you're working 70 hours a week or 80 hours a week, you're smart, you're dedicated, you're unidimensional, and that's how you get to beat all the other people who are doing that. It's the only way. But the problem is, you don't get a life. Now, if you love being a scientist and you have that kind of focus of mind, well, first of all, you're a rare person, and second, you're going to pay for it. But fine, more power to you. But it's a risky business to do that. You sacrifice a lot for it. You know, and I would say most often, if you're speaking about having a healthy life, that isn't what you do. You spread yourself out more. So, you know, you have a family, you have some things that you do outside of work that are meaningful to you and useful. You have a network of friends. Well, those 3 things alone, or 4 things alone, are plenty to keep you well oriented. And then if one of those things collapses, you know, everything doesn't go. Now, the price you pay for that is, the more you strive to optimize that balance, the less likely you are to be fantastically successful at any single one of them. But you might have a very, you know, if you consider your life as a whole, that might be a winning strategy. One of the things Carl Jung said, I really liked this. He thought that men went after perfection and women went after wholeness. So they're different value, they're different, there's something different at the top of the value hierarchy. So perfection would be stake it all on one thing and look for radical success. Not that all men do that, because they don't, but we're talking about extremes, at least with regards to the men that do that. The wholeness idea is more like, well, it's like I want one thing in my life to be 150%, or I want 5 things in my life to be 80%. Well, there's a lot more richness in a life where you have 5 things operating at 80%, but you're not operating at any of them at 150%. So, and I really believe this, because I've watched men and women go through their careers now for a long period of time, and one of the things that, there's lots of things that produce this, but one of the things that I've noticed is that mostly women in their 30s bail out of unidimensional careers. They won't do them. They won't put in the 80 hours a week that they would have to put in order to dominate that particular area. And it isn't, the reason that they won't do it is because they decide it's not worth it. And no wonder, because why would that be worth it? You have to ask yourself that. It's like, well, you want to be an outstanding scientist. It's like, okay, really, that's what you want, because that means that's what you do. Because you're competing with other people, you know, they're smart, they're hardworking, and if you want to be at the top, you have to be smarter and work harder than any of them. And working hard means working long hours. I mean, it also means working diligently, but in the final analysis, it's also an additive issue. If I'm smart and hardworking and I can crank out for 70 hours a week and you do it for 30, it's like in 2 years I'm so far ahead of you, you will never ever catch up. So anyways, and I think partly, maybe part of the reason too that women are oriented that way more than men, I think there's two reasons. One is socioeconomic status does not make women more attractive on the mating market, but it does make men more attractive. And the second is women's time frame is compressed, right? Because guys can always say, well, I'll have kids later, and they can say that till they're like 80. Whereas women, it's like, no way, man, you got to get it together by the time you're, let's say 40, but really probably by 35, but definitely by 40, because otherwise it ain't happening. And that's bloody dreadful. Like the most unhappy people you ever see, no. No. One of the common routes to extreme unhappiness is to want children and not have them. I wouldn't recommend that. You know, you see couples who are in their 30s. 1 couple in 3 over the age of 30 has fertility problems. That's defined as inability to conceive after 1 year of trying. 1 in 3. So it's worth thinking about, because people are very, very unhappy if they want to have kids and then they can't. Man, you're in the medical mill for 10 years if that's what happens to you. Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze you, right? And that's the Hydra, that's the Gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze you and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series. You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious? I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it. And so the problem is terrible, and then the solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving, right? And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from, I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. Okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters. Or how starting to clean up the room changed their life. That's quite fun, because it's something I always tell people to do instead of going out and protesting. Jesus, I just can't stand that.
Cleaning up the room?
Yeah.
Meaning?
Well, my sense is that if you want to change the world, you start from yourself and work outward, because you build your competence that way. It's like, I don't know how you can go out and protest the structure of the entire economic system if you can't keep your room organized. Well, I made a video call, which was called Message to Millennials, where it was called How to Change the World Properly. A bit of it on the pretentious side, I suppose, but I was trying to produce something that was a counterposition to this idea that what you should do is go out and fix up other people. You know, that's just not right. And there's a New Testament line about that, something about, you know, not worrying too much about the log in your neighbor's eye, or about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your eye. What would the world be like if people stopped avoiding the things they knew they should do? You know, because the question is, how much are we contributing to the fact that life is an existential catastrophe and a tragedy? How much is our own corruption contributing to that? That's a really worthwhile question. The things you leave undone because you're angry, you're resentful, you're lazy, you have inertia. Well, you consult your conscience and it says, well, you know, that place over there could use a little work. It's the same as working on yourself, and so you clean that up because you can. And then things are a little clearer around you. And you're a little better off because you've practiced a bit, and so you're a little stronger, and then something else manifests itself and says, well, maybe you could like take a crack at fixing me up too. So you decide to do that, and then that gets a little bit more pristine, you know, and soon, and it's humble because you're not exceeding your domain of competence. You know, it's like don't be fixing up the economy, 18-year-olds. You don't know anything about the economy. It's a massive, complex machine beyond anyone's understanding, and you mess with it at your peril. So, and can you even clean up your own room? No. Well, you should think about that. You should think about that. What could you do to improve yourself? Well, let's step one step backwards. The first question might be, why should you even bother improving yourself? And I think the answer to that is something like, so you don't suffer any more stupidly than you have to. And maybe so others don't have to either. It's something like that. You know, like there's a real injunction at the bottom of it. It's not some casual self-help doctrine. It's that if you don't organize yourself properly, you'll pay for it, and in a big way, and so will the people around you. Now, and you could say, well, I don't care about that, but that's actually not true. You actually do care about that, because if you're in pain, you will care about it. And so you do care about it, even if it's just that negative way, you know. It's very rare that you can find someone who's in excruciating pain who would ever say, well, it would be no better if I was out of this. It's sort of pain is one of those things that brings the idea that it would be better if it didn't exist along with it. It's incontrovertible. So you get your act together so that there isn't any more stupid pain around you than necessary. Well, so then the question might be, well, how would you go about getting your act together? And the answer to that, and this is a phenomenological idea too, it's something like, look around for something that bothers you and see if you can fix it. So now you think, well, let's say you go into you can do this in a room. It's quite fun to do it just when you're sitting in a room, like a room, maybe your bedroom. You can sit there and just sort of meditate on it and think, okay, if I wanted to spend 10 minutes making this room better, what would I have to do? And you have to ask yourself that, right? It's not a command, it's like a genuine question. And things will pop out in the room that you know, like there's a stack of papers over there that's kind of bugging you, and you know that maybe little order there would be a good thing, and you know you haven't, there's some rubbish behind your computer monitor that you haven't attended to for like 6 months, and the room would be slightly better if it was a little less dusty and the cables weren't all tangled up the same way. And like if you allow yourself just to consider the expanse in which you exist at that moment, there'll be all sorts of things that'll pop out in it that you could just fix. And you know, I might say, well, if you were coming to see me for psychotherapy, the easiest thing for us to do first would just be to get you to organize your room. You think, well, is that psychotherapy? And the answer is, well, it depends on how you conceive the limits of your being. And I would say, start where you can start. You know, if something announces itself to you, which is a strange way of thinking about it, as in need of repair, that you could repair, then, hey, fix it. You fix 100 things like that, your life will be a lot different. Now, I often tell people too, fix the things you repeat every day, because people tend to think of those as trivial, right? You get up, you brush your teeth, you have your breakfast, you know, you have your routines that you go through every day. Well, those probably constitute 50% of your life. And people think, well, they're mundane, I don't need to pay attention to them. It's like, no, that's exactly wrong. The things you do every day, those are the most important things you do. Hands down. All you have to do is do the arithmetic. You figure it out right away. So 100 adjustments to your broader domain of being, and there's a lot less rubbish, and there's a lot less rubbish around, and a lot fewer traps for you to step into. And so that's in keeping with Jung's idea about erasing once you've got your mind and your emotions together, and once you're acting that out, then you can extend what you're willing to consider yourself and start fixing up the things that are part of your broader extent. Now, sometimes you don't know how to do that. So you might say, imagine you're walking down Bloor Street and there's this guy who's like alcoholic and schizophrenic and has been on the streets for 10 years. He sort of stumbles towards you and, you know, incoherently mutters something. That's a problem. And it would be good if you could fix it, but you haven't got a clue about how to fix that. You just walk around that and go find something that you could fix, because if you muck about in that, not only is it unlikely that you'll help that person, it's very likely that you'll get hurt yourself. So, you know, just because while you're experiencing things announce themselves as in need of repair doesn't mean that it's you right then and there that should repair them. You have to have some humility. You know, you don't walk up to a helicopter that isn't working and just start tinkering away with it. You have to stay within your domain of competence. But most of the time, if people look at their lives, you know, it's a very interesting thing to do. I like the idea of the room, because you can do that at the drop of a hat. You know, you go back to where you live and sit down and think, okay, I'm going to make this place better for half an hour. What should I do? And you have to ask, and things will just pop up like mad. And it's partly because your mind is a very strange thing. As soon as you give it a name, a genuine aim, it'll reconfigure the world in keeping with that aim. That's actually how you see to begin with. And so if you set it a task, especially, you have to be genuine about it, which is why you have to bring your thoughts and emotions together, and then you have to get them in your body so you're acting consistently. You have to be genuine about the aim, but once you aim, the world will reconfigure itself around that aim, which is very strange. And it's technically true. You know, the best example of that, you have all seen this video where you watch the basketballs being tossed back and forth between members of the white team versus the black team, and while you're doing that, a gorilla walks up into the middle of the video and you don't see it. It's like, you know, if you thought about that experiment for about 5 years, that would be about the right amount of time to spend thinking about it, because what it shows you is that you see what you aim at. And that, man, if you can get one thing through your head as a consequence of even being in university, that would be a good one. You see what you aim at. And so, because one inference you might draw from that is, be careful what you aim at, right? What you aim at determines the way the world manifests itself to you. And so if the world is manifesting itself in a very negative way, one thing to ask is, are you aiming at the right thing? Now, you know, I'm not trying to reduce everybody's problems to an improper aim. People get cut off at the knees for all sorts of reasons. You know, they get sick, they have accidents. There's a random element to being, that's for sure. And so you don't want to take anything, even that particular phrase, too far. You want to bind it with the fact that random things do happen to people. But it's still a great thing to ask.
So vision. Well, how do you develop a vision? Well, you might want to think about, how would you like your life to be? So we could make this practical. We say, this is how you bring heaven down to earth. That's to make the abstract practical. And that's always very useful. That's the differentiation of Jacob's ladder, by the way. That's the axis mundi, the central point of the world. It's like, well, what do you want? Well, let's you could ask yourself that. If you could have what you wanted, what would that be? So we could throw out some possibilities. People trust you. People respect you. And you deserve the trust and the respect. It's not false. People can rely on you. You're good for yourself and you're good for other people. There's productive, generous peace reigns around you, and you can do that in a playful manner. Now, that's not so bad. You could have that, let's say. And if you can think of something better, well, pursue that. But that's a good start. So that's very abstract. And so now you have to think, well, how might you conduct yourself in order for that to occur? Now, one way of approaching that is to differentiate it. You might say, well, what's the purpose of my life? It's a pretty abstract question. You're going to get a pretty general answer. Now, I could say, well, it's to be willing to adopt this spirit of challenge in relationship to life's vicissitudes. But it's still pretty abstract. So, well, yeah, but how do I go about doing that? Well, you have to differentiate it. That's the bringing of the divine message down into the realm of practical applicability. How do you make that principle real in your own life? Well, here's one way of doing it. Where do people find the significance in their life? So you could envision participating in this process. Well, what do people generally need and want? Well, here we can make a list. So this is, imagine we're taking that general principle. That's the golden cap of the pyramid. That's even the eye above the pyramid. That's another way of thinking about it. It's this superordinate principle, uniting monotheistic principle in some real sense. Now we have to differentiate it. Well, most people would like an intimate relationship. Okay, and so what does that mean? Well, intimate means physically intimate, but it likely means emotionally intimate, and it probably means iterating across some reasonable period of time, unless you just want everyone around from whom you're deriving physical gratification to be the whim of the moment, in which case you're basically a psychopath, and I wouldn't recommend that as a pathway forward. you're a narcissistic psychopath. And you might think, well, I get what I want. It's like, well, no, you won't, because your life will degenerate. So that's a bad theory. So you want an intimate relationship, and then you're going to have to treat that other person. Well, how? Well, you can win an argument with your wife today, but then tomorrow, there she is in all her defeated glory. And so I don't know what the victory is going to win you. Maybe you want to negotiate towards something like productive and generous peace with her instead. And that's all part of this intimate relationship. And then it becomes truly intimate. And then it's stable across time. And that might be desirable. Then you have a platform, let's say, that will help you stabilize your entire life, because part of the reason you're going to do things is because you want to be of service to at least one other person, and vice versa. Because if it's just for yourself, that's pretty damn dismal and immature and pointless and futile. And it doesn't work anyways. So you've got at least someone else you can serve in this mutually sustaining manner. So most people want an intimate relationship. And they'll settle for second-rate derivations thereof, but still what they want. Fine. Probably want something approximating a family, and even if you're not going to have kids, and I think that's a very bad idea, by the way, not to have kids. Well, you have your parents and your siblings, and if you don't have them, you have your extended family. You might want to stabilize and fortify your relationships with them, because why not? No, why not make peace with your father and your mother and your siblings if you can? And then you get to practice making peace, and then you have a family. That seems okay. And then you probably want some friends. So you could have a vision for your friendships. And what sort of people do you want around you? Well, I can tell you at a minimum, you want people you can tell bad news to, who are on your side during the times of bad news, who don't engage in competitive martyrdom with you. And you want people you can tell good news to, because they'll celebrate what you have to celebrate. And then you can do that mutually. And you want people to exchange your thoughts with, and you want people to play with. And you probably want that to iterate across time, because then you get to know each other and you can foster each other's development in a more profound manner then. And so you're going to be pretty miserable and not very sane without friends. So probably some friends aren't a bad idea. How about a job or a career? Well, why? Because the fundamental state of human being is one of deprivation, and you have to work to address that. So you have to work. And it could be a job, which is something you have to do because you're paid, but hopefully there's some vocational element to that you can find some deep intrinsic meaning in your work. And you can certainly do that if you're working with your hands. You can find a sustaining meaning in the responsibility you take in relationship to your job and your career. And then I would say also, if you're good at it, so you're skilled at what you do, plus you're a good team player, I don't care where you're working, it could become a real center of the world for you. When I was a kid, 14, 15, 16, I worked in restaurants for years, and I really liked that. And that's a very complicated thing to do, to work in a restaurant. I was just a dishwasher and then a cook. As I moved up the ladder, let's say, and I learned to cook and I learned to clean and I learned to be hospitable and I learned to work in a complex, dynamic environment, because a restaurant is exactly that. And, I got along with the people I worked with, and I came to work on time and I did my bloody job and I tried to do it right. And so most of the people who were my superiors, so to speak, were happy with me. They wanted me to be there and I wanted to be there. It was still a pain when I was a kid sometimes to have to go to work when my friends were out, drinking beer at the local river. And I might have wanted to do that instead. But fundamentally, immersing myself in that environment was positive in every sort of way and made me more responsible and mature. And I enjoyed it a lot. Many of the best memories I have from my adolescence in particular are the times I spent working in the restaurants that I worked in. And you can do that in a masterful manner. There are great restaurants where you walk in and everything's perfect. It's so hospitable. Everyone is treating everyone else extremely well. The food is of immense quality. Like, that's a paradisal place. And you can work to make that. I don't care where you're working, you can work to make that happen. You can treat the people around you right. You can treat your customers right. You can shed your bitterness and your resentment. You can take on the lowly status of your beginner job as if it's also a field of unlimited opportunity, which it is if you can get your head around it. And then that can be part of the vision of your life. And then you can think about that job or career as something that unfolds and develops across time too. And if you make a commitment where you are locally, I don't care where it is, your opportunities are just going to multiply like mad. You know, so like if you're a short order cook at a restaurant, you have a single shift and you're a really good cook, you'll find pretty soon that the restaurant is much busier when you're cooking and that people are pretty damn happy to be there. And you'll get a reputation with your boss. If he or she has any sense and any greed of the proper sort whatsoever, they're going to recognize you. And then, you know, maybe you move from that restaurant to a restaurant with more possibility, or at least somewhere else with more possibility. And you can do that. I don't care where you are. If you have the opportunity to have a job and you're not working with people who are entirely tyrannical and pathological, if you make the right sacrifices in that position and you have the proper vision, which isn't based on resentment. Oh, why do I have to do this stupid job? It's like, well, it's going to be a stupid job if that's the attitude you have towards it. Instead, if you try to foster all the interpersonal relationships you have in that environment, you'll find that there's an infinite amount of possibility right there in front of you, like there always is. And so, what else? Well, how about some education? You know, you're probably not as informed as you might be, and probably something interests you. It's like, well, why don't you delve into that a bit more and make something more of yourself? Educate yourself to the limits of your intelligence and make a plan for that. And you can do that formally, or you can do it informally. You can do it by reading. There's many great books, and they're not expensive. In fact, the greater the book, the less it costs, weirdly enough. And so you can just do that. You can make a plan. I want to read a book a month, or a book every 6 months, or a book a day. I don't care. Or I want to listen to a podcast a week, or something like that. It's like, expand yourself a bit. Have a plan to be educated. What else? What should you do with your time outside of work? Well, play a good game, right? Maybe you want to do something creative. If you're high in openness, that's probably what you want to do. Maybe you want to take on some civic responsibility and duty. That's what you might do if you're conscientious. Maybe you want to care for someone if you're agreeable. Or maybe you want a new domain for your ambition if you're more disagreeable. Maybe you want to work to make your family more secure. That would be a good way of constraining your trait neuroticism. Maybe you want to expand your social engagements. You're extroverted. It's like, fine, those are good things to do with your time outside of work. They're all matched to your temperament. You can mix and match and do a bunch of those things at once. You know, I used to talk to my students at the U of T and say, well, how much time, by your own definition, how much time do you waste a day? And the median, which is the most typical amount of time wasted, was always about 8 hours. It's like, oh, you waste half your awake time. And you wonder why things aren't going for you that well in your life. You can just do the economic calculations. Well, let's say you're worth $25 an hour, all things considered. Maybe you can't find a job that would pay you that much, but that doesn't mean your time is only worth what you could attain in a given job, because everything you do now echoes into the future. And so let's say it's $25 an hour just for the sake of mathematical computation. Well, that's $200 a day. It's $1,400 a week. It's $5,600 a month. It's basically $70,000 a year. So every year that you spend wasting 8 hours a day, you deprive yourself of the equivalent of a full-time and somewhat generous income. So that's just, and if your life isn't going very well, you might think, well, maybe it's because I waste half of it. That there could be some relationship between those things. Then you might ask yourself, well, what would happen if I wasted none of it, like zero? And you might say, well, how difficult is life? Well, it's ultimately difficult. It's like, yeah, well, it is. So how much of it do you have to use properly in order to contend with that ultimate difficulty? And the answer might be, well, all of it. And if you're not, well, you're going to suffer, obviously, because it's difficult. And so if you're wasting time, then you're going to suffer. And so you might want to have a vision for what you do with your time. And you could ask yourself, well, if I could conceptualize and structure my free time the way I wanted to, what would that be? And then you'll have a vision. And that it's like a revelatory vision in some sense if you ask the question properly, because you can ask yourself these questions. You can ask yourself them in the micro domain. Let's say you come home from work every day. to your waiting wife and children, just to take a stereotyped example. It's like, well, you're doing that every day. How would you like that homecoming to go? If you could have it the way you wanted it to be, it's like, what would you like your wife, how would you like your wife to welcome you when you returned home? And then you could sit down and talk to her. It's like, I come home every day. That's every day. That's like 15 minutes of every day. That's an hour a week. It's 50 hours a year. It's 1 work week. It's 2% of my life. It's like, how do I want to be welcomed when I come home? And your wife might say, well, how do I want you to welcome me when you come home? You might think, yeah, well, maybe we could get both of those right together. And then we could be welcomed in a way that was really good for both of us. What would that look like? Well, you know, I'm tired when I get home. And she might say, well, I'm tired too, because I've been taking care of the kids all day. And he might say, well, I don't want to hear about every problem that happened at home the second I get in. And she might say, well, I don't want to hear about all your problems at work right away either. It's like, okay, but we do need to talk through the problems. It's like, yeah, that would be helpful. So, you know, when I come home, why don't I say, honey, I'm home, and why don't you come and give me a hug? And why don't we notice for a moment that we're happy to be together, which is why we got married to begin with, and we could appreciate the fact that we're together, and then maybe we could have something to eat, and we can figure out how to arrange that. And then maybe we could sit for 15 minutes and talk about what happened during the day. And that could be our routine. It's like, well, what do you think of that? Well, here's how I'd modify it. It's like, okay, let's modify it that way. Well, then we'll implement it and see how it works. And then it's like 2% of your life fixed. You do that 50 times, which isn't that many times. It's 100% of your life is fixed. And then when it's fixed, you can even make it better. And doing that 50 times is just not that much. And lots of things iterate, right? You do the same thing every day. You get those things you do every day right, man, you're on the way to having your life together. That's the ritualization of time and space in some real sense. And the application of what's essentially a religious attitude to all the elements of your life that you might otherwise regard as mundane. Oh my God, I have to do the same thing every day. It's like, hey, that's your life, man. The things you do every day. Get those things right.
I wouldn't consider myself either naive or a particularly optimistic person. I don't think I'm either of those. But this is actually an idea, this is one of the only ideas that I've ever found that I really believe to be rock solid. I actually think that it's true. And it's very optimistic because it says you can use your sense of meaning to calibrate your progress through life. But there's rules. You have to aim at the highest possible good that you can conceive. Now, and that's subject to update, because what the hell do you know? But you start by aiming at the star you can see rather than the dimmer one that you can't yet perceive. And then you decide that you're going to do that honestly, right? That's a big decision. So the first decision, I think, in some sense, is a decision of love. You're going to decide that being is worthwhile and that you're going to work for its betterment. And that's a decision that's based on love. And the second decision is based on truth. Having made that decision, you're going to play a straight game. Having made those two decisions, I think that you can allow your sense of meaning to calibrate your pathway. And then what's so interesting is that you hit a state that's as close to paradisal as you're going to hit right away, because being engaged like that, it's better to be engaged in the solution of a complex problem than not to have a problem at all. And that's no different than saying it's better for there to be being than non-being, because being is a problem. And so if you want to have no problems, then you have no being. And you could say, well, being is so miserable that maybe that's the route we should take. And fair enough, but maybe you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have the damn problem. It can be a problem worth solving, and you can be so engaged in solving the problem that it justifies the fact that the problem exists. And then you get to have the problem and the solution at the same time, and maybe that's better than not having the problem at all. And I believe that, because one of the things I have seen, and I've seen this being so interesting when I've been lecturing to people, especially more recently, and this is also manifested itself on YouTube. I'm talking to people a lot about responsibility, and it's young men in particular that seem to be responding to that. And I think that's partly because I think that young women, in some sense, have their responsibility map already laid out for them. It's also less voluntary in some sense for women because they have more complicated problems to solve in the first part of their life, right? Because they have to get the family problem solved. But whatever. I've been talking in a very delineated manner about responsibility, which is a strange thing to sell to people, but responsibility is what gives your life meaning. And so then you might say, well, then take on ultimate responsibility. And what happens? You have an ultimately meaningful life. And then you might say, well, if your life is ultimately meaningful, it doesn't matter if it's punctuated by tragedy or even predicated on tragedy. It's worth it. And I think that's true. And everything I've seen indicates to me that's true. Every time I get my clients to take on more responsibility, you know, and it isn't an injunction. You're a bad person, you should take on responsibility. It has nothing to do with that. You can define the damn responsibility. It isn't something that someone else should impose on you. It's not a matter of doing what you should do in some abstract manner. It's not that. It's the choice of what game you're going to play. And you know, you can play the game of the seeker, I would say, and if you play that game, then everyone wins. And it's the best game you can play. And so the answer in some sense to the tragedy of life, to the catastrophe of life, to the fall, is to adopt the responsibility of mortality that goes along with that, and to play that game maximally. And paradoxically, it's in the willingness to do that that the solution emerges. And I don't, you know, I have done my best with every single thing I've talked to you guys about. I have done my best to do what Dostoevsky does in his novels, which is I make a proposition and then I spend months or years trying to figure out if I can take the bloody thing apart, if there's something wrong with it, because I want to find out. I want to hit it with a hammer and see if it breaks. And what I've been trying to do is to tell you all the things that I've gathered, let's say, or laid out or articulated or discovered over the last 30 years that I have not been able to break with the biggest hammer that I could take to them. And I guess that's the fundamental one, is that I believe that the idea that lurks in these images, derived from very different cultures, it's the same idea. Life is suffering. Right, indisputable. What do you do about that? You voluntarily accept it and then strive to overcome the suffering that's a consequence of that. And you do that for you, and you do that in a way that makes it better for other people. And then that works. And one question might be, well, how well does it work? And the answer is, the only way that you can find out is by trying it. That's it. That's the existential element of it. The proof is to be derived by the incarnation of the attitude in your own life. No one can tell you how it will work for you. It's the thing that your destiny is to discover that. And you have to make the decisions to begin with. It's like, because you can't do this without commitment. You have to commit to it first. That's the act of faith that Kierkegaard was so insistent upon. You have to say, I'm going to act as if being is good. I'm going to act as if truth is the pathway to enlightenment. I'm going to act as if I should pursue the deepest meaning possible in my life. And there's reasons to do none of those. They're real reasons. So it's really a decision. But you can't find out what the consequence of the decision is unless you make the decision. I think the same thing happens when you get married, by the way. So if you think you might leave, you're not married. And then you think, well, the marriage didn't succeed. It's like, well, maybe you were never married. Because the rule is, you don't get to leave. And there's a reason for that rule. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't situations where there should be exceptions made for that. That's not the point. The point is that there's some games you don't get to play unless you're all in. And the other thing that's so interesting about being alive is that you're all in. No matter what you do, you're all in. This is going to kill you. So I think you might as well play the most magnificent game you can while you're waiting. Because do you have anything better to do? Really? Why not pick the best thing possible that you could do? Why not do that? Maybe you could justify your wretched existence to yourself that way. I think you could. That's what it looks like. You know, people find such meaning in the responsibilities they adopt, it stops making them ask questions about what life is for. If you have a newborn child, for example, like unless you're really in a bad way, psychotically depressed, or maybe your personality really needs some retooling, you stop thinking about anything but ensuring that that baby is doing well. And if someone comes along and asks you an existential question about your commitment to that, the right response is, why are you asking me such stupid questions when this is manifesting itself right in front of your eyes? Like, how blind can you be? That isn't a time for questions about the meaning of life. The answer is right in front of you. And if you can't see it, it's not because life has no meaning, it's because you're blind. I mean, that's what the image of the Virgin Mother and the child is all about. It's like, what's the answer to the meaning of life? Here's an answer. It's like, well, I'm going to criticize that. Well, go right ahead. You know, it's like what you're like a what do you call that? A termite gnawing on a temple. There's no utility in that sort of criticism. It's blindness. And it's the same thing with regards to the path of the hero. It's like it glistens in front of you and you can criticize it. It's like, fine. Put the cart before the horse and see how far you get. So I thought, to bring full closure to the class, I was trying to solve this terrible puzzle that confronted me and many other people about how it was that human beings got themselves in such a tangle about what they believed. Such a tangle that we were pointing the ultimate weapons of destruction at one another, which, by the way, we are still doing. And I thought, okay, well, I understand that. We need our belief systems. They orient us. And that means there will be conflict between belief systems, and that can be a catastrophe. And that's being played out everywhere, again, in very many ways. What's the solution to that? Well, one possibility is there's no solution. It's just mayhem all the way around. Could be the case. But it seemed to me, as I delved into it, that the proper solution to that was to live properly as an individual. Because you're more powerful than you think. Way more powerful than you think. I mean, God only knows what you are in the final analysis. You're blind to your own weaknesses, but you're also blind to your own strengths. And so then I think, well, if you got your act together, it'd be better for you, and instantly it would be better for your family, assuming they wanted you to get your act together, and not everyone does, and then it would be better for the community. It's like, how far could you take that? If you stopped wasting time, and if you stopped lying, and if you oriented yourself to the highest possible good that you could conceive of, and you committed to that, how much good could you do? Well, I would say, why don't you find out? So that's what I think you should do. You should find out. You don't have anything better to do. And there's nothing in it, as far as I've been able to tell, there's nothing in it but good. So maybe you could sort yourself out so that you wanted nothing but the good. And then maybe you could help make that manifest in the world. And maybe we wouldn't have all these terrible problems then. At least we'd have fewer of them, and that would be a start. So it's the answer to the problem of humanity is the integrity of the individual. That's the answer. So, and states that are predicated on that realization are healthy. So, and states that aren't are doomed to stagnation and catastrophic collapse. And personalities that are predicated on self-tyranny and the tyranny of others are doomed to collapse. So, and then you think, well, what's the barrier? And the barrier is, are you willing to accept the responsibility? And part of the answer to that is, reduce the damn responsibility until it's tolerable. You don't have to fix everything at once. You could just start by fixing the things that you could fix. Or you could even do it more. You could do it with even less self-sacrifice. You could start by fixing only the things that you want to fix. God, you can get a massive way that way. So do it. See what happens. That's what you should have been taught in university right from the beginning. It's like, aim at the highest good. Tool yourself into something that can attain it. And go out there and manifest it in the world. And everything that comes your way will be a blessing. And so All you have to do is give up your resentment and your hatred. I know that's a hard thing to give up because you have plenty of reason for it. That's probably a good place to stop. So it was a pleasure.
We were sitting in the first row of the plane, and do you remember the guy was a young black man, sort of ran onto the plane. He was wearing a yellow vest. He was a worker working the bridge or something. And he came up to you and he said, I'm not supposed to be on the plane right now. I'm not supposed to say anything, but you helped me turn my life around. I got this job because of you. And what I remember more than anything else is he had this huge smile on his face. But it wasn't because you told him to go out there and be happy. It was because you told him to go out there and fix some stuff. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about right now.
Those experiences are so life-sustaining. It's so remarkable to have that happen, and that's something I've been immensely privileged to constantly experience, although there's also something about it that's extremely painful. You know, the magnitude of that joy is sort of proportional to the obstacles it had to overcome while it was attempting to manifest itself. You know, and one of the things I'm sure you saw on the tour, and I don't know how this affected you, was the depth of hunger for encouragement that exists everywhere, as far as I can tell. And everyone wants to be appreciated when they bring their best to the table. That's why the current assault on merit is so unbelievably brutal, because it will deny everyone the right to be appreciated for being their best. And well, you might ask, well, when does the best become your enemy? And that's easy. It's when you flee from it.
If you're suffering, you are obligated, in a sense, to hold on to whatever rope someone throws you. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. You can tyrannize yourself into doing things, but I wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend instead is that you ask yourself what you're willing to do. It's a really effective technique. It's like a meditative technique. That's when life is worthwhile. I don't know exactly what's going to help you, but don't arbitrarily throw out any possibilities because you might not have that luxury. Antidepressants help a lot of people, and there are technical reasons why that's the case. If you're offered a gift by your society and it works, try it. I don't care what your presuppositions are. The time you see people who are suffering with depression, for example, there's a multitude of reasons, but I'll take one common reason. You could think about it as associated with the story of Peter Pan. Peter Pan is someone who won't grow up, right? Now the problem with Peter Pan is he gets to be king, but it's king of Neverland. Neverland doesn't exist. So being king of nothing isn't that helpful. Well, one of the things that you often see with people who suffer from depression, and I'm not making a blanket statement about the cause of depression because there's lots of them, is that people who don't have enough order in their life tend to get overwhelmed. So for example, if someone comes into me to see me and they say they're depressed, I always ask them a very standard set of questions. Do you have a job? If you don't have a job, you're really in trouble in our society. First of all, your biological rhythms tend to go off the rails right away because there's no reason to go to bed at any particular time and there's no reason to get up. And for many people, if they don't get up at the same time, they foul up the functioning of their circadian rhythms, and that's enough to make them depressed right off the bat, especially if they start napping during the afternoon. They also don't have a purpose. People aren't good without a purpose, and this isn't hypothesizing. We absolutely understand the circuitry that underlies positive emotion. When you're attending to something you're interested in and you're engaged in it, that's when you're alive. That's when life is worthwhile. It's so worthwhile that in those moments you don't even ask the question about it. The question itself goes away because the meaning that you're united with is so powerful that it can push back the adversity that would otherwise characterize life. Nietzsche said, the person who has a why can bear any how. We know how it works. Almost all the positive emotion that any of you are likely to experience in your life will not be a consequence of attaining things. It will be a consequence of seeing that things are working as you proceed towards a goal you value. That's completely different. And you need to know this because people are often stunned, for example, they finish their PhD thesis and their presupposition is that they're going to be elated for a month. And often instead they're actually depressed and they think, what the hell, I've been working on this for 7 years and I handed it in and what do I do now? And that's what depresses them, right? It's the what do I do now? Well, they're fine if they enjoyed it, pursuing the thing, as long as it was working out, they get a lot of enthusiasm and excitement out of that because that's how our nervous systems work. Most of your positive emotion is goal pursuit emotion. If you take drugs like cocaine or amphetamine, the reason they're enjoyable is because they turn on the systems that help you pursue goals. That's why people like them. So if you don't have a job, you got no structure, that's not good. Plus, you tend not to have a point. So you're overwhelmed by chaotic lack of structure and you don't have any positive emotion.
So as men move into their careers, how might responsibility and purpose be conceptualized? Well, look, so I always start from the fundamental observation that life is characterized by a fair bit of suffering. There's a tragic element to life. Tragedy tainted by malevolence. And what that poses a problem, and the problem is, well, what can sustain you through suffering and tragedy, betrayal and illness, death, loss, disappointment, frustration, confusion. And it's not hedonism. It's not happiness. Not if you conceptualize happiness in this narrowly pleasure-seeking hedonic way. First of all, that doesn't iterate very well. You know, you can drink 26 of vodka one night and that might be a pretty fun night, but you know the next 2 or 3 days are not going to be so pleasant and you'll probably do at least 5 things that you seriously regret, assuming you can remember what they are. So it's not a great strategy, and everyone knows that you know, that casual, impulsive pleasure seeking is not, it's not a good game. Everyone knows that. And that doesn't mean you should be afraid to try it, right? That's entirely different. You need to bash yourself around a bit. What did William Blake say? Wisdom through excess. There's definitely something to that. So, you know, walling yourself away from experimentation, that's not a good idea. But falling prey to indulgences, that's a catastrophe. So you can't find, and then if your life is proceeding in a direction that's painful and tragic for reasons that might be really out of your control, obviously you're not going to be happy during those times. You may not have even the opportunity to seek anything that's pleasurable or the ability to experience it. So then what's going to sustain you under those circumstances and sustain your will to live, but even more importantly, protect you from the resentment and the moral corruption that unrequited suffering can so easily produce? And the answer to that is not happiness, but something like meaning. And then you might ask yourself, well, where is meaning to be found? And the answer seems to be primarily through the voluntary adoption of responsibility. You know, so people find meaning in the love they have for their partner and their decision to care for someone else as well or better than they would care for themselves. They find meaning in that, and it can sustain itself across many, many decades, for better or for worse. That's no joke, that phrase. They find meaning in the relationship they establish with their children, assuming they take the responsibility for that relationship. They find meaning in their friendships. They find meaning in their business associations, their civic engagement. You know, people moralize at, older people moralize at younger people and say, well, you should accept your responsibility, you should shoulder your duty. And that's true, but it isn't exactly that you should do it because you should do it, even though you should. It's that there isn't anything better that you can possibly do. Like, you have to justify yourself to yourself. You have to justify yourself to yourself because of your inadequacies and your failure and your error and your propensity to repeat errors that you know you shouldn't repeat, your sinful nature. You have to atone for that. And then you have to justify your life to yourself because it's characterized by death and suffering. And so you need something worthwhile to do. And, well, then you might say, well, there's nothing worthwhile to do. It's, well, you're probably not really in any position to make that judgment, you know, till you've gone all in at least one thing. At least one thing. Because, like, who the hell are you? You're 16, you're cynical and nihilistic. It's like, you're not wise. You're not a philosopher. You don't know anything. And thank God, right? Because you don't even want to think you know anything because you're bloody miserable and you're suffering. And so if you're also right, well, then you're doomed. So you better bloody well pray that your cynicism and nihilism, unearned though it may be, is based on a fundamental falsehood. And it is. You can find deep significance in your life, and you find it essentially through the decision to voluntarily bear your suffering and to trudge uphill nonetheless. And there's something heroic about that in the most fundamental sense. And that heroism is something so deeply meaningful that it, in some sense, triumphs over even death. And so, as you move forward through life, you mature, you start by developing responsibility for yourself, your friends, your roommates, then you take on a partner, and you have a family, and you expand the domain of responsibility and generosity, and you want to expand that. Who knows how much you can expand that? You know, you could be a credit to the nation. Well, there's an aim. Why don't you aim to be like credit to the nation by the time you're 50? Because what, you got something better to do than that? And the answer to that's no. And, you know, what are you going to do? You're going to pursue endless one-night stands. You're going to bury yourself nose deep in cocaine. You're going to become an alcoholic. You're going to pursue that tinsely, trashy hedonism that is nothing but destructive and generates nothing but self-contempt, and then bitterness, then misery, then vengefulness. It's like, that's why do that? I mean, it's easier in some sense, right? Although it's not, because it's rife with catastrophe and suffering. So it's way better to take on, to envision yourself as, that's the cross image fundamentally, right? The pathway to redemption is to bear your cross up the hill voluntarily. It's a hell of a thing to ask, right? Because you have to accept the fundamental limits of your mortal vulnerability. And you have to say to yourself, I will do good nonetheless. Right? And that's not obedience. That's not naivete. That's a cold decision, man. So everyone great makes that decision. So make that decision, because maybe you're great.
That's that willingness to gaze into the abyss, which is obviously what you were doing when you went to Ukraine. It's like, it's gazing into the abyss that makes you better. The thing is, and this is maybe where Nietzsche's idea is not as differentiated as it became. Sometimes your gaze can be forcefully directed towards the abyss, and then you're traumatized. If it's involuntary and accidental, it can kill you. The more it's voluntary, the more transformative it is. And that's part of that idea about facing death and hell. It's like, can you tolerate death and hell? And the answer is, this terrible answer is, yes, to the degree that you're willing to do it voluntarily. And then you might ask, well, why should I have to subject myself to death and hell? I'm innocent. And then the answer to that is, even the innocent must be voluntarily sacrificed to the highest.
That's such an interesting distinction. Voluntary suffering.
Voluntary, yeah. Yeah. Well, that's why the central Christian doctrine is pick up your cross and follow me. And I'm speaking not in religious terms saying that. I'm just speaking as a psychologist. It's like one of the things we've learned in the last 100 years is voluntary exposure to that which freezes and terrifies you in measured proportions is curative. The first thing I do as a clinician, if someone comes to me and says they're depressed, is ask myself a question. Well, what does this person mean by that? So I have to find out, like, because maybe they're not depressed, maybe they're hyper anxious, or
Maybe they're obsessional. Like there's various forms of powerful negative emotion. So they need to be differentiated. But then the next question you have to ask is, well, are you depressed or do you have a terrible life? Or is it some combination of the two? So if you're depressed, as far as I can tell, you don't have a terrible life. You have friends, you have family, you have an intimate relationship, you have a job or a career. You're about as educated as you should be given your intelligence. Use your time outside of work wisely. You're not beholden to alcohol or other temptations. You're engaged in the community in some fundamental sense, and all that's working. Now, if you have all that and you're feeling really awful, you're either ill or you're depressed. And so then sometimes there's a biochemical route to that, treatment of that. My experience has been as a clinician is if you're depressed, but you have a life and you take an antidepressant, it will probably help you a lot. Now, maybe you're not depressed. Exactly. You just have a terrible life. What does that look like? You have no relationship. Your family's a mess. You've got no friends. You've got no plan. You've got no job. You use your time outside of work, not only badly, but destructively. You have a drug or alcohol habit or some other vice, pornography addiction. You're completely unengaged in the surrounding community. You have no scaffolding whatsoever to support you in your current mode of being or you move forward. And then as a therapist, well, you do two things. Well, if it's depression per se, well, like I said, there's sometimes a biochemical route, a nutritional route. There's ways that can be addressed. It's probably physiological if you're, at least in part, if you're depressed but you have an okay life. Sometimes it's conceptual. You can turn to dreams, sometimes to help people, because dreams contain the seeds of the potential future. And if your person is a real good dreamer and you can analyze dreams, that can be really helpful. But that seems to be only true for more creative people. And for the people who just have a terrible life, it's like, okay, you have a terrible life. Well, let's pick a front. How about you need a friend, like one sort of friend? Do you know how to shake hands and introduce yourself? I'll have the person show me. So let's do it for a sec. So, yes, hi, I'm Jordan. And people don't know how to do that. And then they can't even get the ball rolling.
For the listener, Jordan just gave me a firm handshake.
Yeah, as opposed to a dead fish. You know, and there's these elementary social skills that hypothetically, if you were well cared for, you learned when you were like 3. And sometimes I had lots of clients to whom no one ever paid any attention. And they needed like 10,000 hours of attention. And some of that was just listening because they had 10,000 hours of conversations they never had with anyone. And they were all tangled up in their head. And they had to just, one client in particular, I worked with this person for 15 years. And what she wanted from me was for me just to shut the hell up for 50 minutes, which was very hard for me. And to just tell me what had happened to her. And then what happened at the end of the conversation, then I could discuss a bit with her. And then as we progressed through the years, the amount of time that we spent in discussion increased in proportion in the sessions until by the time we stopped seeing each other, when my clinical practice collapsed, we were talking about 80% of the time. But she'd never been attended to properly, ever. And so she was an uncarved block in the Taoist sense, right? She hadn't been subjected to those flaming swords that separated the wheat from the chaff. And so you can do that in therapy. If you're listening and you're depressed, I would say if you can't find a therapist, and that's getting harder and harder because it's actually become illegal to be a therapist now because you have to agree with your clients, which is a terrible thing to do with them. Just like it's terrible just to arbitrarily oppose them. You could do the self-authoring program online because it helps you write an autobiography. And so if you have memories that are more than 18 months old that bother you when you think them up, part of you is locked inside that. An undeveloped part of you is still trapped in that. That's a metaphorical way of thinking about it. That's why it still has emotional significance. So you can write about your past experiences, but I would say wait for at least 18 months if something bad has happened to you, because otherwise you just hurt yourself again by encountering it. You can bring yourself up to date with an autobiography. There's an analysis of faults and virtues, that's the present authoring, and then there's a guided writing exercise that helps you make a future plan. That's young men who do that, to go to college, young men who do that, 90 minutes, just the future authoring, 90 minutes, they're 50% less likely to drop out. That's all it takes. Like I had clients who were so depressed they literally couldn't get out of bed. So what's their first step? It's like, can you sit up once today? No. Can you prop yourself up on your elbows once today? Like you scale back the dragon till you find one that's conquerable, that moves you forward. There's a rubric for life. Scale back the dragons till you find one conquerable, and it'll give you a little bit of gold, commensurate with the struggle. But the plus side of that, because you think that, God, that's depressing. You mean I have to start by sitting up? Well, you do if you can't sit up. But the plus side of that is it's the Pareto distribution issue, is that aggregates exponentially increase. And failures do too, by the way, but aggregates exponentially increase. So once you start the ball rolling, it can get zipping along pretty good. This person that I talked about was incapable of sitting with me in a cafe when we first met, just talking, even though I was her therapist. But by the end, she was doing stand-up comedy. So, it took years, but still, most people won't do stand-up comedy. That's quite the bloody achievement. She would read her poetry on stage too. So for someone who was petrified into paralysis by social anxiety and who had to start very small, it was a hell of an accomplishment.
I had lots of clients and students who were chaotic in their orientation to life. They didn't know what to do, and they didn't know what to do about not knowing what to do. It's like, I don't know what to do with my life, and I don't know what to do about my ignorance. And my reaction to that, in some sense, wasn't exactly the reaction of a clinician, because not a typical clinician, because typical clinicians are liberal Protestant in their fundamental orientation, and they tend to think of psychological development as something like self-actualization, right? It's really a self-development process. But that wasn't my observation, partly influenced by the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget. I had a more communitarian view of human development than that, and my observation was that most people find the cardinal meanings in their life not as a consequence of the development of their self, whatever that is, but in service to other people, in the adoption of responsibility. Because you're told, be responsible, and it's a finger-wagging thing again, that if you were a good person, you be responsible, you do your duty. But no one ever says, well, because that's where you find the abiding meaning in your life, and you need that meaning to sustain you through suffering. And that's definitely the case. I was very ill for a number of years, and a lot of what got me through that wasn't my own special nature, let's say, but the support of my family and the support of my friends and the support of the broader community made a huge difference, not only psychologically, because I knew people were supporting me, but also practically. You build yourself a community, you sacrifice yourself in the service of other people, not so much because you should, although you should, but because that is where meaning is to be found, and you need a deep meaning to sustain you through tragedy. That's the arc. And you find that deep meaning, and there's a notion that it's better to give than to receive, and it sounds like a Hallmark greeting card in some sense, and people are cynical about that too. Well, yeah, you say that because you should be good and think that, but if you watch yourself, you'll see that it's true, because one of the things that's been really pronounced element in my life is that people thank me from time to time for things that I've done or said, and there isn't a better experience than that, that you've put something out that's actually a manifestation of what you truly believe, and the consequence of that is part of the redemptive process for someone else. There is nothing that's better than that. Zero, nothing. In fact, I don't think there's anything that's even in the same conceptual universe of that in terms of its intrinsically rewarding properties. There's nothing better than to have people, perhaps particularly people you've never met, tell you that what you have been doing has had a salutary effect on their lives. And so that's a hell of a fine thing to aim for. And why not aim for it, you know? Because you could do it. If you put, I wouldn't even say necessarily that you put other people first, because I think that's a mistake, but I do think it's the case that you treat other people in the manner that you would wish to be treated if you were treating yourself properly. And that's also a sophisticated thing, right? To learn to treat yourself properly. Because that doesn't mean you get to fulfill every momentary whim, because that's what you do when you're 2, and 2-year-olds can't live without their parents. You know, you have to be wise enough to govern your current behavior in light of the future. And that's really what it means to be an adult. It's what it means to forestall gratification and to attain the responsibility of an adult. And the reason that you should do that, because you should, is because it's actually better, you know, in all ways. It's a panacea for suffering to adopt that responsibility. So I would tell my clients and students as well, it's like, well, let's just take a look at where other people find meaning. You know, and we'll see how your life matches with that. Do you have an intimate relationship? Yes or no? The right answer is yes. Now, maybe not for you, and maybe you don't right now, and maybe you have your reasons not to because you're a singular person in that regard, but probably not. Because that's like a third of life. And so if you don't have that, that might be one of the reasons you're not doing so well. And the fact that you don't have it might be an indication that you're not oriented in the proper direction. Oh, I can give you an example of that. I had many people question me when I was just on tour. This is a question that came up quite rapidly, often in the Q&A sessions. How do I find the right person when I'm dating? How do I find the person who's right for me when I'm dating? And I got that, or on the internet. I got that question like 3 times in a row, and I thought, because I always think this, what about that question? What's wrong with that question? Something wrong with that question. How about, how do I conduct myself so that I am the best possible partner? Now that's a whole different, right? That's a whole different conceptual universe, and virtually no one ever asked that question. And I would say, well, if you want an answer to the first question, which is how do I find the person who's right for me, you actually start by asking the second question, which is what can I bring to the table for someone else? And if you're really good at bringing something to the table for someone else, hey man, people might be lining up to be your partner. And if they're not, then you might think, well, maybe I'm just not bringing the right thing to the table. And that's worth thinking, especially if you're desperate, you're lost, and you're alone. It's like, maybe I got this wrong. And I usually sort of top that with the suggestion that even if you did find the person who was perfect for you, and they're that perfect, what makes you think they wouldn't take one look at you and run screaming away? And they likely would if they were that perfect, because, really, are you that much of a catch? And if you think you are, that might be part of the problem. So that's one, right? Intimate relationship. So I would say to you at the crossroads, develop a vision for your relationship. There's a gospel saying, which is, of course, impossible to comprehend or believe. Knock and the door will open, ask and you will receive, seek and you will find. And people think, well, no way, the world's not constituted like that. It's like, it goes back to the idea of aim. If you don't aim at it, you're not going to hit it. And it might also go back to a question about what do you mean by ask and what do you mean by want? Because it isn't just some casual request. You're praying to God, I wish I could find my wallet or something like that, as if he's the casual granter of magical wishes, like a fairy with a magic wand. It's not that. Asking means something like this: I am willing to give up everything that I'm doing wrong so that I can put things right, if I could know what right was. And that's you're on your knees when you say that, man. And maybe if you're on your knees, you get the answer. And so that's worth thinking about. So, if you knocked and you wanted to walk through and you asked and you wanted to learn, and you sought because you wanted to find, maybe you would receive and be answered and find, but not without aim. And so I might say, well, look, if you could have the relationship you wanted, you get to have the relationship you want and need. But you have to know what it is. And so then you need a vision of that. It's like, and a developed vision, Not, I need to find the person right for me. It's like, what do you mean by that? No. How about how are you going to treat your partner when they come home from work? How about something that concrete? Or how would you like to be treated when you come home from work? Or what sort of partner do you want in relationship to their attitude towards children? You have to make it real, you know, like it's the story of your own life, which, by the way, it is. And then maybe you find it, because at least once you've developed the vision, if it manifests itself, you'll recognize it. That's something. Why don't you set your family right? No, you need siblings. Maybe you don't have them. Set your relationship with your parents right. Fix your relationship with your father, with your mother, with your siblings. The same thing. And then what sort of relationship do you want to have with your children? You know, if you could have what you wanted. I had a very good relationship with my children. My daughter, as I said, was very ill, so that made things complicated. But I had a great relationship, and still do, with my son. It's one of the lights of my life. And we concentrated on making that relationship pristine, you know, both of us, and my wife as well. And so you imagine, well, I want my son to love me. I want my son to respect me, and vice versa. I want a child who can make mature decisions. I want someone I can rely on. I want someone who other people gravitate towards. Because I can have what I want if I'm willing to make the proper sacrifices. And so that's a good thing. Could you set your family straight? Well, you need a job or a career. So what can you offer, and what can you bring the world in that regard? And then I would say, well, if you're thinking about career success in this Tower of Babel manner, then that's a temptation. But you might think, well, how much good could I do if I had the opportunity in the shortest possible period of time, if I went all in? And then there's an aim, man, there's an aim. And then you might think, well, what would that look like? You know, if I was a light to my community, if I was a light to the people I work with, who would I be if I was like that? And then you can conceptualize that, and you can see when you deviate from it, and why couldn't you correct for the deviations and move towards that? And then you might say, well, are you going to make productive use of your time outside of work? Productive and generous use of your time? Productive, generous, and meaningful use of your time. How about that? You're going to control your susceptibility to temptation, regulate your alcohol and drug use, because alcoholism takes out lots of people. Regulate your sexual temptation. You can control yourself for some reason that's worth controlling yourself for. You know, because there's something to being sybaritic. There's at least the momentary pleasure. It's not nothing. And you're not going to sacrifice that, if you have any sense, unless you sacrifice it to something clearly better. How about this gentleman second from? Yes. John's got the mic there.
Thank you. I don't want to look behind me how many people are here, because I'll get a bit nervous to ask this question. Also, this may not apply to many, so I expect your answer might be a bit short. I'm a vet and currently serving police officer in WA, and I've got PTSD, and I'm at the Marion Centre, which is a mental place, and they let me out today.
Oh, yeah?
Legally. I just wanted to ask you, how do I move from day-to-day hedonism and ideations and risk the hope and cautious optimism of a long-term life with the conditions I currently have, or for anybody who might be having complex PTSD and living day-to-day?
Well, I mentioned this program that I have online, this self-authoring program. One thing you might try doing it. So so it's got 3 parts. The first part is a guided autobiography. And what it asks you to do is break your life down into 7 epochs and 7 stages. Sometimes people do that by relationship or by year or by occupation, however you choose. And then to detail out the most significant emotional events of your life, especially those that still hold some emotional valence. And that would help, because what happens with PTSD in some sense is that the narrative through which you see the world fractures. And because it fractures, your perceptions and your consequent emotional responses become chaotic. And that chaos produces a stress response, a chronic stress response. And so what you need to do to recover from PTSD is to knit the story back together. And I had a client who had PTSD, very seriously affected. She was only 17, And she was so fractured that she was diagnosed with severe schizophrenia. And when I first saw her, she could barely talk. And she could barely focus her eyes. And she would move her hands up and down, and I could, like she was grasping for something. And I asked her why, and she said that she could see lines in front of her and that she was trying to interact with them. I mean, when your perceptions are fractured, you're in pretty rough shape. And it turned out that she had been terribly bullied by a boy whose amorous advances she had rejected, and he set out to make her life hell, and certainly succeeded. And I had her walk through this past authoring program in the course of therapy. And she could hardly write to begin with. And we went through her life right from the beginning. And as we went through it, she got more and more coherent. And by the time we had brought her up to date, including walking through this catastrophic bout of bullying and the school's absolute inability to do anything about it, she had glued herself back together. So the other thing I would carefully recommend, especially if what traumatized you happened more than 18 months ago, is that you spend some time either writing about it, or another thing to try is just before you go to sleep, bring the memory to mind, and not enough to push you farther than you want to go, but as vividly as you can, and then let it go. Like, don't push yourself harder than you can. You'll see, you want to initiate a process of active engagement with the dragon that burned you, fundamentally. The psychophysiological pattern of active engagement is the opposite to the psychophysiological pattern of involuntary stress. And so if you can practice embodying that voluntary confrontation, then that stance can come to dominate. And that's the stance you want to dominate, because that moves you forward voluntarily into the world. And so, and that, in all probability, that will work. So I had this is a friend of mine, he had PTSD, and he had been brutalized in a Canadian residential school when he was a kid, and it was bloody rough, like Auschwitz level rough. It was really bad. You can't listen to his story without it like breaking down, it's bad. And he told me that he hadn't looked in a mirror for 40 years. He was unable to face himself, And he also told me that when he dreamed, he was still 8 years old in his dreams, same age he was when the cataclysm occurred. And that he had started to become aware that he was stuck in his dream. He's kind of a visionary guy. He's an artist, this guy. And so I suggested that he spend a little bit of time in front of the mirror each night before he went to bed, just taking a glance at himself. Because he had not looked at himself for so long, he didn't even know how old he was. So what happened in his dreams, this was so cool, he started to age in his dreams. So instead of being stuck at 8, then he was 10, and then he was 12, and eventually, he did this for a number of months, eventually he got as old in his dreams as he was in real life. And what that meant, like imagine your dream image it's the representation of yourself in imagination. And if it's stuck 50 years in the past, then your self-concept is in some sense hasn't been updated for that period of time. Just that process of voluntary engagement, which was him being willing to look at himself in the mirror, despite his shame, his deep shame at what had happened to him, that was enough to pull him back together. So that should work. That should work, The other thing with PTSD, it's also very useful to develop something approximating a sophisticated philosophy of good and evil, because people generally have PTSD because they've been struck by something malevolent. And so it's not just tragedy, there's malevolence in it. Reading, there's a couple of books I'd recommend. One is called Ordinary Men. It's about a police battalion in Germany who was trained to do heinous things in World War II. It's a great book, Ordinary Men. It's a great book. And another one I would recommend is called The Rape of Nanking. And these are rough books, man. The woman who wrote The Rape of Nanking, she committed suicide. It's a rough book. But the utility of the books is that they universalize malevolence. So almost everybody who's traumatized has been either touched by their own malevolence or by witnessing it or being subject to it at the hands of someone else. And one of the consequences of that is that if you don't have an advanced philosophy of good and evil, you have no place to put the contact with malevolence. Part of the utility of the doctrine of original sin was the universalization of malevolence. So, you might say, and it's true, that there's a little bit of Hitler in all of us, and there's a little more than a little bit, you can be sure of that. And that's a pretty cataclysmic realization. And you might say, well, how can you bear that self-understanding or the revelation of that kind of malevolence in the world? And the answer is, in part, by understanding it as part of the eternal conditions of existence. The idea that the state, the sovereign of the state has an evil uncle, that's an idea as old as time. So for the Egyptians, that was Set. And the sun sets, by the way, because the spirit of Set is what devours the sun at night. And Set is the root word for Satan. And so even the ancient Egyptians knew that malevolence that it was worthwhile contemplating the existence of malevolence as an independent spirit. And that allows you to take responsibility in some sense for the existence of malevolence in your own life, but it also universalizes it so that it's not exactly about you, right? It's more a reflection of the structure of existence as such. And that can allow you to detach yourself from it a little bit. And that can be extremely useful too. Okay, well, so that's another issue in some sense that seems to make the postmodernist critique even more correct. How in the world are you going to extract out a canonical interpretation of something like that? It's like it's not possible. But here's the issue, as far as I can tell. So the postmodernists extended that critique to the world. They said, look, well, a text is complicated enough. You can't extract out a canonical interpretation. What about the world? The world's way more complicated than a text, and so there's an infinite number of ways that you can look at the world. And so how do we know that any one way is better than any other way? And that's a good question. Now, the postmodern answer was we can't. And that's not a good answer, because you drown in chaos under those circumstances, right? You can't make sense of anything. And that's not good, because it's not neutral to not make sense of things. It's very anxiety-provoking. It's very depressing, because if things are so chaotic that you can't get a handle on them, your body defaults into emergency preparation mode, and your heart rate goes up and your immune system stops working, and like you burn yourself out, you age rapidly because you're surrounded by nothing you can control. That's an existential crisis, right? It's anxiety-provoking and depressing, very hard on people. And even more than that, it turns out that the way that we're constructed neurophysiologically is that we don't experience any positive emotion unless we have an aim and we can see ourselves progressing towards that aim. It isn't precisely attaining the aim that makes us happy. As you all know, if you've ever attained anything, because as soon as you attain it, then the whole little game ends. Then you have to come up with another game, right? So it's Sisyphus. And that's okay, but it does show that the attainment can't be the thing that drives you, because it collapses the game. That's what happens when you graduate from university. It's like you're king of the mountain for one day, and then you're like surf at Starbucks for the next 5 years, you know? So, yeah. So what happens is that human beings are weird creatures, because we're much more activated by having an aim and moving towards it than we are by attainment. And what that means is you have to have an aim, and that means you have to have an interpretation. And it also means that the nobler the aim, that's one way of thinking about it, the better your life. And that's a really interesting thing to know, because, you know, you've heard ever since you were tiny that you should act like a good person, and you shouldn't lie, for example. And you might think, well, why the hell should I act like a good person, and why not lie? I mean, even a 3-year-old can ask that question, because smart kids learn to lie earlier, by the way. And they think, well, Why not twist the fabric of reality so that it serves your specific short-term needs? I mean, that's a great question. Why not do that? Why act morally? If you can get away with something and it brings you closer to something you want, well, why not do it? These are good questions. It's not self-evident. Well, it seems to me tied in with what I just mentioned. It's like you destabilize yourself and things become chaotic. That's not good. And if you don't have a noble aim, then you have nothing but shallow, trivial pleasures, and they don't sustain you. And that's not good because life is so difficult, it's so much suffering, it's so complex. It ends and everyone dies and it's painful. It's like without a noble aim, how can you withstand any of that? You can't. You become desperate, and once you become desperate, things go from bad to worse very rapidly when you become desperate. And so there's the idea of the noble aim, and it's not something, it's something that's necessary. It's the bread that people cannot live without, right? That's not physical bread. It's the noble aim. And what is that? Well, it was encapsulated in part in the story of Marduk. It's to pay attention, it's to speak properly, it's to confront chaos, it's to make a better world. It's something like that. And that's enough of a noble aim so that you can stand up without, cringing at the very thought of your own existence, so that you can do something that's worthwhile to justify your wretched position on the planet. So now the literary issue is that, look, you take a text, you can interpret it a variety of ways, but that's not right. This is where the postmodernists went wrong, because what you're looking for in a text, and in the world for that matter, is sufficient order and direction. So then we have to think, well, what does sufficient order and direction means? Well, you don't want to suffer so much that your life is unbearable, right? That just seems self-evident. Pain argues for itself. I think of pain as the fundamental reality because no one disputes it, right? I mean, even if you say that you don't believe in pain, it doesn't help when you're in pain. You still believe in it, right? You can't pry it up with logic and rationality. It just stands forth as what the fundament of existence, and that's actually quite useful to know. Say, well, you don't want any more of that than is absolutely necessary. And I think that's self-evident. And then you say, well, wait a minute, it's more complicated than that. You don't want any more of that that's necessary today, but also not tomorrow and not next week and not next month and not next year. So however you act now, better not compromise how you're going to be in a year, because that would just be counterproductive. That's part of the problem with short-term pleasures, right? It's like act in haste, repent at leisure. Everyone knows exactly what that means. So you have to act in a way that works now and tomorrow and next week and next month and so forth. And so you have to take your future self into account. And human beings can do that. And taking your future self into account isn't much different than taking other people into account, right? Because I remember there's this Simpson episode, and Homer downs a quart of mayonnaise and vodka. And he says, Marge says, you shouldn't really do that. And Homer says, that's a problem for future Homer. I'm sure glad I'm not that guy.